Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. And boy have I been looking forward to this. We're done Zelda 1 and 2, so we're finally able to jump into one of my all-time favorite games, A Link to the Past. Every time I boot this game up, it's like visiting an old friend. I adore it to bits. And I still hold firm that it is one of the best games in the series. I don't think it's controversial to say that this was the point in which, after a rocky first two games, they got it right. A Link to the Past establishes a lot of series staples, including the freaking Master Sword, and it takes what worked in the last two games and does it all better. So unlike my videos for the NES titles, which covered all of their games' respective dungeons in a single video each, there's finally enough diversity to talk about here for me to actually break this up into a dungeon per video, just like with the other games that we've already discussed. Some of these may be slightly shorter videos. I might combine some of them into one. We'll see how it goes and what feels right. But before we step into the game's first dungeon, there's a few pre-dungeon things to get out of the way, as usual. Just as I did with the last two games, I am once again playing this game on Switch via NSO using the SNES controller. It just feels right. Though I could bust out my childhood SNES cartridge, and let's be honest, there's no shortage of ways to play this game. It's one of those titles that Nintendo just seems keen on releasing and re-releasing on every single one of their platforms. And I'm okay with that. But for the sake of convenience and picture quality, this is how I'll be doing it here. This game also leans far more heavily into the lore side of things, which I just love, giving us this nice opening prologue, which you'll get by just fine without, but it adds a nice bit of flavor to the story. And I really can't stress enough how much more accessible to new players this game is over its predecessors. It takes a lot of those established ideas that I talked about last time, but streamlines it in a way that makes things feel far more balanced. Not every moment of this game is life or death, and I appreciate that change in pacing. The story may be nothing to write home about overall, but it's prevalent enough that it still works to drive things forward. It's that perfect middle ground. This game also features my favorite in-game keyboard, which might be a really weird detail, but I don't know, I just love how this thing is. The game itself opens in Link's house as he receives a telepathic message from Zelda, who is held prisoner in the castle dungeon. So we immediately disobey our uncle's wishes to stay home, grab a lantern, and sneak out to the castle. And even before we've entered the castle itself, the game is subtly guiding us with environmental clues and NPC dialogue to point us in the right direction. It's all very masterfully done, but without ever compromising on the atmosphere of this scene. I could go on and on. In fact, I'd love to, but where things really kick into gear is within the game's tutorial dungeon, Hyrule Castle. We may as well get into the dungeon design stuff, it's in the video title after all, so let's sneak through the outer gardens and drop down into the dungeon. Welcome to the series' first ever visit to Hyrule Castle. And this is how you do an in-game tutorial. You keep things engaging, you keep the lessons subtle, and you make an area that feels like a condensed version of how the larger game after this will play. That's what Breath of the Wild gets so right with the Great Plateau, and it's what this game gets so right here. Before we get into the design of the castle itself, just a quick side note about the music. I love it. The music outside leading up to the dungeon had this tense feeling of anticipation while the music was competing with the sound of rain, which was great. But as soon as we open the doors and set foot inside the castle, the cymbals crash, that opening bar kicks in, and the music just screams, it's time for business. It's just the right balance of feeling dramatic, dangerous, and triumphant. It's actually kind of incredible how far video game music had evolved between the first two entries in the series and this game. Don't get me wrong, the chiptunes of the NES are iconic, but we have such distinct instrumentation here. It's masterful. I don't think we praise the Super Nintendo's sound chip enough. For the time, this was incredible. The castle theme is iconic and has the perfect atmosphere for this place. In fact, this theme is so good that almost every iteration of Hyrule Castle after this game would rehash it. There's moments that feel tense, uncertain, dangerous even, and triumphant. I love it. But how about the dungeon design itself? Hyrule Castle introduces to the player how combat and dungeons will work for the rest of the game in a streamlined and bombastic way. It's an exciting opening above all else, making subsequent playthroughs feel consistently fun to go through. So many other Zelda games have a tutorial issue, where I dread starting a new save file because I don't want to have to sit through doing chores like herding goats and bird practice. This game, on the other hand, keeps things feeling engaging, so whether it's your first time or your 23rd, you won't find yourself bored or dreading a long slog of an introduction or tutorial to get through. This isn't a particularly difficult dungeon, but that is by design. It's not meant to be. It's meant to stay fun while teaching you how this game works. Right at the start, you get a sword and shield from your dying uncle, and get to fight a couple of guards, though you can just as easily skip right past them. So first we have an optional fight in a small narrow area, where you can't be surrounded or overwhelmed by enemies, with a small reward at the end of it, showing you that going out of your way is encouraged. Then we have to get into the castle through the front gardens, but the area is specifically made in such a way that there is a barrier between you and your enemies. You have to cut through the bushes here for any of them to be able to reach you. So it's all your initiative. This is combat on your terms. You won't be blindsided. Then we get inside and we have essentially the entire first floor to explore freely. This first section of the castle interior also has our first instance of another series staple, the dungeon central room, which gives you a grounding point to keep yourself oriented while navigating. And I can't stress enough how important these become to dungeons after this. From here, there are several branching paths and different routes that you can use to reach your goal. So the game lets go of your hand a little bit and lets you just play around and get used to things. But no matter which direction you take, you'll end up getting to the right place eventually. There's a fair amount of enemies here to fight, with slightly more powerful ones, and I do mean slightly, sprinkled around depending on where you go. But the place is littered with recovery hearts, so you're not really in any immediate danger. It's all a controlled environment for you to learn in, but it doesn't feel like it. That's the best part. So the game lets you learn by doing, by just trying stuff out. And the floor plan is essentially a giant loop. And while there are a few deviations you can make, it feels more open than it really is. You can even get out here onto the castle rooftops, but aside from a memorable hint towards a later scenario in the form of this energy barrier, every path will loop you either back to the front doors or loop around to the back stairs, which take you down to the castle basement. The only exception is the throne room, which we'll return to later, but for now it's a dead end, forcing you back to the central room where you can try out another path. Essentially, the navigation here is set up in a way to ensure that you get to the right place, but it gives you a large explorable area and allows you to move about freely and figure that out yourself. Then we get into the basement, which is a far more linear section, which it has to be so that it can slowly introduce critical mechanics to you. First off, it introduces the dungeon map, which is thankfully back, and found in this painfully obvious chest. We find our first locked door and key, which is dropped by the soldier in this room. Also, we can knock these guys down this chasm. We'll also find our first instance of running into a locked door and having to take a minor detour to actually find the key, rather than it just being dropped by an enemy in the same room. It's only a single side room, but again, this is just them showing us that these are the tropes that the game will follow. So it's a deliberately simple take on the concept that later dungeons will iterate on. We also find our first dungeon item, the boomerang, which is pretty much optional here. Really, the lantern that we get from home is far more critical, but the game is still showing us that we'll find and use important items. Then we'll have what is essentially a mid-boss fight against a ball and chain soldier. For an experienced player, this guy isn't that tough, but for any new players, he may pose your first very real threat. Once defeated, he'll drop the key to Zelda's cell so that we can rescue her. After that, it's time to backtrack with Zelda in tow. And look, a loop! I complained about the absence variants of these in Zelda 2, but here already we have a shortcut back, a loop in the path, to make backtracking that much more manageable, and I love to see it. Zelda also gives us a couple hints for navigation, initially telling us to return to the first floor, then upon reaching the central room, she says there is a secret passage in the throne room, which if you recall from earlier was the only dead end. We'll push the ornamental shelf aside, and then it's down through the castle sewers to escape. This section is a little less interesting from a design perspective, but gameplay-wise, it is still very fun and engaging. It's essentially a dimly lit, long, linear path with no detours or deviations, but that's okay, we had a taste of that already. Instead, the game is now letting us master what it's taught us, by having us face different kinds of enemies, and by hitting us with frequent locked doors, and forcing us to thoroughly explore the rooms that we're in, solve puzzles, and find keys to those locked doors. I love that these passageways are so dark as well. The limited visibility just gives the whole place a more dangerous feeling, like we don't know what's ahead of ourselves, so we have to be extra diligent. What began as an infiltration is now a hasty escape. We can often light torches to temporarily light up the rooms that we're in, but those don't last, and you have to be thorough to find them, as they're usually tucked into the corners of the rooms. Maybe it's just my niche tastes coming into play here, but I love the enveloping darkness here. It's the same sort of vibe I found so captivating back in Vah Rudania's first section, and I can't help but love it here. It does sort of artificially make us feel smaller than we are in these narrow corridors, and the results can be argued, but I personally just love the atmosphere of it. The only potential deviations from the main path here is a pair of bombable walls found in this room. We will be able to come back for them later, but for now we have no bombs, and if I'm being honest, I'm not really a fan of that. I've already made this complaint in several other videos, but I hate not being able to get everything in a dungeon in one go. I don't want to have to come back here later. Overworld secrets? Absolutely, yes, I will happily come back for those when I have the appropriate items. But when they do this in dungeons, it kind of drives me bonkers. It's not the end of the world though. The very final puzzle is a weird one that I'm not really a fan of either. You're confronted with a pair of levers to pull. One will open the door and the other will drop a bunch of snakes on you. They're not that hard to deal with really, but it's just a nuisance, I guess. There isn't a way to know beforehand which is which, so you just have to know or try them out. So on a first playthrough, that gives you just a 50-50 shot of getting it right. It isn't super unfair or egregious, but I just don't like the idea of having to play the odds like that, I guess. It's not the biggest sin, but not a design choice I'm fond of either. After that, we reach the sanctuary, get an earful of exposition, receive a heart container, and then we are set loose into the world. Sadly, there's no boss fight or anything of that sort this time around, but that's okay. Unless you count those snakes, maybe. Or the ball and chain guy? I don't know. So that's the first dungeon of A Link to the Past. Maybe it's my nostalgia speaking, but overall, I really like this segment of the game. It's atmospheric, and it's a great introduction to the game's mechanics and design ideas. It introduces to us the first ever main central room, which makes navigation more manageable by having the various paths all branch off from one memorable focal point. It introduces to us its key system, first with a key hidden in the same room as its corresponding locked door, then having a minor detour to find the next key, followed by some contextual puzzles and a combat gauntlet. Essentially, we have a little taste of how open navigation will work, and then a little taste of linearity. And hey, as far as escort missions go in video games, the escorting itself is barely noticeable. And have I mentioned that it achieves all of this while setting up the game's narrative? I love this place, but I do have a couple of nitpicks. I think the sewer system that you escape through could be a room or two shorter, or at least have a little more variety with its locks and keys. Maybe instead of arranging them in such a strict linear sequence, we could have at least one branching path or detour, but since the first half of the dungeon already has that openness, it's at least somewhat more balanced in that respect. I also wish the boomerang was at least somewhat integrated into the design here somewhere. It could be something as simple as just having a switch we have to activate somewhere suspended over a pit or something. The boomerang is a series staple and will get put to use elsewhere, but it feels like a missed opportunity to not have a use for it here within the dungeon it's found in. So overall, while the dungeon isn't all that challenging, that's sort of the point of a tutorial, isn't it? But few games get their introduction sections so right, either making their tutorials a slew of text, which can be overwhelming for new players, or just not making it very fun or interesting, which can be a total bore for returning players. A Link to the Past's Hyrule Castle never stops being fun for me to revisit though. Maybe it's nostalgia, maybe it's because I get too much of a kick out of knocking these guys down these chasms though. Jokes aside though, I love how the game doesn't inundate you with an in-your-face tutorial section, but instead creates a carefully crafted environment that lets you play around in and learn things for yourself. That's the best kind of teaching a game can do. I never dread returning to this game because I'm so pulled in immediately by how engaging it all is right away. The dungeon design of this game is leaps and bounds ahead of its predecessors, and there's no better showcase for that improvement than right off the bat here in the game's opening moments. So while the dungeons only get better from here, this is still one of the best tutorial sections of any Zelda game. After leaving the sanctuary, there's a little bit more story setup to do before we reach the dungeon itself, but nothing that should take too long to do. There's a handful of secrets to find, including a few heart pieces, but as far as mandatory stuff goes, the list isn't too long. Zelda herself suggests that in order to defeat Ganon, we'll need to find the Master Sword, and so she sends us to speak with Sahasrahla, the village elder of Kakariko, in order to learn of its whereabouts. As it turns out, when we get to his house, we do indeed get to learn about the Master Sword, but Sahasrahla himself is not around. But we can explore the village to find more info. While here, it's worth getting the 2 bottles that are obtainable here, as well as bombs and the net. Otherwise, this kid marks Sahasrahla's location on our map, located east of Hyrule Castle. We can head over there, get some exposition from Sahasrahla, and he'll ask us to go to the nearby Eastern Palace to find the Pendant of Courage, promising us a reward after that. It's just a short walk over to the dungeon itself, though there's a fair amount of baddies to fight here, including these Armos. Nothing too difficult though, so with all of that out of the way, we may as well get right into it. Let's head into the dungeon. Welcome to the Eastern Palace, the first proper full-length dungeon of A Link to the Past, and I gotta appreciate the level design here. The palace offers a nice balance of an open, explorable area and then combat gauntlet approaching the boss fight. While this structure is basically a carryover from Hyrule Castle, it's actually done a bit better here in my opinion. It's essentially iterated upon and improved over the last dungeon with some added challenge. Since the game has already given us its tutorial dungeon, it can now put what we've learned to the test, but without the difficulty spiking too suddenly. This is still the first full-length dungeon after all. Still though, the Eastern Palace features overall tougher enemies than those found in the castle, and a greater variety of them too. From Stalfos who actually dodge and avoid your attacks, armored and imposing Igors, fire fairies who can't be killed whatsoever, these sea enemies, they're They are called Popo, and there are a variety of traps and obstacles to keep you on your toes. The architecture here is nothing spectacular to note, but I do find it interesting that the place has a handful of Igor statues, almost like foreshadowing of the enemies being scattered ahead. While the origin of the Eastern Palace is not very well explored in this game, the fact that the Pendant of Courage is found here, in addition to the exposition given to us by Sahasrahla afterwards, my headcanon has always been that this place is some sort of fort or garrison the Knights of Hyrule that Sahasrahla talks about may have used as a base of operations. Not unlike the Akala Citadel in Breath of the Wild, its placement on the map would have made it a good stronghold for defending the kingdom. Sahasrahla also states that the knights were the guardians of the Pendant of Courage, which is found in the very depths of the dungeon. There isn't really much more to go on here in terms of architecture or iconography, but that's just always felt like the implications to me. The music of this dungeon is also a piece I have such nostalgia for. The game's soundtrack titles it Lost Ancient Ruins, and the song has such a palpable feeling of mystery and danger. There's this constant ramping tension that rises and falls. I love it. The dungeon navigation here is surprisingly stellar. It's a pretty short dungeon, taking me only about 10 minutes to breeze through casually, so maybe I've never really taken note on just how well designed it really is. But playing it again while taking notes for this video has really opened my eyes to just how well this dungeon plays. There's a handful of optional rooms with secrets, such as cache, as well as a fairy fountain hidden off the central room, so even though the dungeon already offers a fair balance for combat challenges, while not overwhelmingly difficult, between hearts being plentiful to find and the fairy fountain being at the very center of the dungeon, where it's always easily accessible, the game is essentially inching the challenge up for players while still being very forgiving. And this early on in the game, that just makes a lot of sense. I mentioned it already, but it really does have that perfect balance of linearity and openness here. I mean, the sequence of events here is still technically very linear. You have one critical path to follow, but it gives you space to move about, hit dead ends, and explore some more. We can see that right from the start, albeit at a very small scale. When we enter the dungeon, right here in the foyer there are 3 doors we can choose from. Both of the side doors are immediate drops into a bottomless pit, so while the center door is the only way to actually go, it still makes things feel a bit more open and explorable than it actually is. That center door is also locked, with a switch to open it hidden under this pot. Every one of these pots we've found up until now has actually been entirely optional. In fact, there's a chance that this could be the room in which players discover they can even interact with these, so the developers locking the door until you figure that out is important here. The solution seems painfully obvious to us experienced players, but keep in mind that objects that you could lift and throw did not exist in the first 2 Zelda games. It just wasn't a thing until now. Even in Zelda 1, you could only place but not throw bombs. So they essentially lock you in here until you figure out and learn this mechanic, and it will come up again later. The next room features some minor enemies and another floor switch that opens the door, but this one is slightly less obvious. It blends in with the floor somewhat. Nothing too challenging. The sense of danger gets amped up a bit more in the next room, where we're forced to avoid this infinite barrage of orbs, and we're confronted by our first proper fork in the road. This path snakes around the room and rewards us with some optional treasure, again reinforcing for us that exploring is good and will be rewarded. In fact, that treasure is visible and teased to us right when we first enter the room. The other path takes us into the dungeon's central room, and man, I love this room. It's iconic and visually striking. which is important, by the way, since it works to incentivize and tease us a little bit. We're initially limited to this upper balcony, but we can see a big treasure chest in the center of the room that we can't yet reach. The player's curiosity is tickled here. We naturally want to figure out how to get down there to see what's in store for us. We also get our next fork in the road here. Heading right takes us down this path, which loops nicely back on itself, where we'll find the dungeon map. The left path takes us to the compass, which we did not find in the castle, but returns here again from Zelda 1, showing us where the end goal is. And then it's downstairs to the lower part of the central room. Just a note before we get there, but I love that while exploring here, we can always see other parts of the dungeon. There is overall just a great sense of interconnectivity about this place, much like the praises I had for Dodongo's Cavern back in the day, with the bridges and paths that overlap the rooms here. It just makes the place feel more real and connected, and visually way more distinct than the samey room designs of the first two games. It also, like the big chest example in the central room, constantly tickles that player curiosity, because we can see that there is more room to explore just out of reach. We can see in both of these rooms that there is a lower section below us that we'll need to tread through later, and then these blocks form a one-way path, blocking us, teasing us that there's something there. So it makes the dungeon feel both cohesive and visually interesting, while driving us forward and guiding us down the critical path. When we arrive in the lower part of the central room, we'll find that the big chest that was teasing us is actually locked, another first in the series, forcing us to find the big key before we can open it. The same goes for the northern door. So while the room here appears and feels open with those branching paths, we only have one way to actually go, through the right side door. This takes us into the lower part of this room and into this dark room, which is a loop with two doors. One is locked, so we have to take a minor detour through the other to find the key, just like we did earlier in the castle. The path then crosses over the orb room from earlier and into this room, which has a combat-centric puzzle challenge, after which we'll find the big key. We're looped through that one-way path and back to the central room. Now we can open that big chest for the dungeon item, the bow, which will be needed up ahead. We can open that northern door now, and there's one more fork in the road, with the right room being entirely optional. It's just cash. The left path takes us down a series of room-specific challenges, which will put our new bow to use, having us fight our way through these baddies, most notably the red Igors, all the way up to the boss room. So we've got that balance I mentioned earlier of explorable open space earlier in the dungeon, and now a linear gauntlet of challenges. And unlike the castle sewers, which were the same concept, I don't feel as much like this section overstays its welcome. It may pose a serious challenge to new players, especially as a kid I always found the Igors super intimidating, but for returning players it is a breeze to power through with that bow. With all of that out of the way, we have one more challenge ahead of us, the dungeon boss. Entering the boss room, we'll immediately encounter 6 statues which come to life before our eyes. These are the Armos Knights. In essence, 6 tougher versions of the Armos enemies found outside, and they'll serve as our first boss battle. They aren't too hard, but offer a fair challenge as well as having 2 distinct phases of the battle. The only other time that we've actually seen that so far in the series was with Rebonak in Zelda 2, and even then it was not done nearly as well as here. The first phase will have us battling it out with the group as a whole. You can use your sword or bow to fend them off and inflict damage as the group moves about in a variety of formations around the room. Your sword will work, but the bow is far more effective and will allow you to keep a safe distance from them. The second phase begins when only one is left. It doesn't matter which one, and they will change tactics. They'll turn red and attempt attempt to stomp on you. So you've got to pull this sort of cat and mouse tactic, constantly pulling back, striking, and then carefully dodging. Unlike the first phase with the group as a whole, now he'll aim far more deliberately for you, rather than just moving about in formations. So while you probably won't get overwhelmed, you have to be far more cautious and stay moving. I like this. The boss goes from somewhat passive to growing in aggression. It's good stuff. Plus, the overall size and scope of the battle is pretty fun. They aren't the biggest or most imposing boss in the game, but they do the job well enough. Once they're defeated, we'll receive our heart container as usual, and the Pendant of Courage, and can return to Sahasrahla, and we'll get some swanky new Pegasus boots as a reward. And after some more exposition, we'll be on our way. So that's the dungeon. Overall, the Eastern Palace is a good and fair step up the difficulty curve from Hyrule Castle, while still feeling like a good starter dungeon. Not a tutorial, but a test of your skill, while reinforcing to us the ideas established earlier, and introducing to us a handful of new enemies and mechanics. It all feels dangerous and adventurous. Another improvement over the castle is that this time around, the dungeon item actually feels like it matters. As it should, since its placement here feels like such a deliberate focal point of the dungeon design. The bow is needed to defeat harder enemies, in particular those red Igors, as well as making other enemies and the boss much easier. I complained that the boomerang wasn't well integrated into the level design of the castle, so it's great to see them work that in nicely here. I think there is still room for improvement though. It gates you from defeating those red Igors, sure, but there aren't any memorable puzzles that put it to use. Besides, you won't even encounter any of those red guys until after getting the bow. It is still mandatory for progression, as there are some sealed doors ahead of where you found it that will only open if you kill said Igors. But it would have been nice to see some actual dungeon mechanic or puzzle that requires it, even if it was just shooting a switch or something. Still though, the sense of navigation through this dungeon is stellar. Whoever came up with this floor plan was brilliant. It's leagues ahead of the first two games and a great follow-up to the castle. That sense of interconnectivity as the rooms connect, loop, and overlap keeps things constantly feeling interesting to explore. They have just the right amount of branching paths, dead ends, and little teases to keep you moving through this place, and the challenges scale really gracefully. For example, the first encounter with an Igor is in the central room, where they can be easily ignored and avoided. Then we have to fight one later to get the big key, but he can be killed easily with a throw and pot. Then we have a room with two of them, and the pots are not so accessible, so we have to carefully use either the bow or sword. Then a room with three of them, then one harder red one, and then a pair. The first time we encounter any Stalfos can be in either of these two rooms depending on which path you take. Both rooms have fewer of them in a wider open space. Lots of room to operate and get used to fighting them. Then it's in a smaller room, and then it's in the dark. You get the idea. Each time you're forced to fight a new type of tougher enemy, they pace it out nicely. This also applies for obstacles and traps, such as these orbs, which first must be avoided in this hallway, which has some great spacing and nooks to hide in. Then the concept is revisited in this room, which is much more chaotic, where we have to activate a floor switch to open the door. So overall, the Eastern Palace shouldn't be too hard to get through, but it feels like the dungeon is training you in a way. The game has already taught you how to fight and navigate in the castle, so now it's making you apply those skills, and introducing you to a greater variety of enemy types, which all behave very differently, all while incorporating more detours and branching paths, then capping it all off with the game's first boss battle. While I find the Armos Knights to be not a particularly amazing fight, they serve their purpose well enough. The rest of the dungeon feels so well thought out though, that I just can't help but love this place. After getting the Pegasus boots from Sahasrahla, he'll mark on our map the locations of the next two dungeons, as well as the Master Sword. Already this early on in the game, we can see the overworld design gating us in terms of progress. That is to say, the established dungeon order is in full gear here. The game is placing barriers in our way, which we need certain items to overcome, slowly unwinding the overworld to us as we make progress. In order to reach reach the Tower of Hera, which sits at the peak of Death Mountain, we need the Power Glove, the item found in the Desert Palace, to lift this rock. But to get into the Desert Palace, we need the Book of Mudora, and in order to get the book, we need the Pegasus Boots, which we can only get after finishing the Eastern Palace. You can technically walk up to the dungeon entrance earlier than that, but you just can't get in without that book. Remember in a previous video when I said that some dungeons feel like picking apart a tangled knot? That's what this particular part of the game as a larger whole feels like to me also, but on a larger scale. It's very Metroidvania in a sense. Personally, I like this. We're still in the first act of the game, so to speak, so slowly unraveling the explorable space to us isn't a bad design idea, and it makes that sense of progression feel like an accomplishment in a way. We also get introduced to the Dark World in a limited area, which is going to be important later on in the game. That said, there's also some optional stuff we can do between dungeons as well, such as collecting heart pieces. After getting the Power Glove, we can also get the flippers, upgraded shield, and magic boomerang, which are all worthwhile. With all of that out of the way, we should get into the dungeon design itself. So after praying at this altar and crossing through the Dark World briefly, we can head into the dungeons. We're in for double dungeon duty today. The Desert Palace and Tower of Hera are both fairly short dungeons, but they nicely complement each other in terms of their design ideas. That is to say, they are basically polar opposites. I guess after both Hyrule Castle and the Eastern Palace both followed essentially the same design formula, but executed somewhat differently, they decided that the next two dungeons ought to shake things up a bit, and that is always welcome. In essence, the Desert Palace is a large open sandbox, while the Tower of Hera is basically one straight linear path up the tower. In a way, I guess this is like the two sections of the Eastern Palace, but expanded upon and separated into two distinct dungeons. Well, mostly of course. The Desert Palace also has a bit of a gauntlet leading up to the boss, like the Eastern Palace had, but it seems clear to me that the emphasis is more so on that first section, which is far more robust. Likewise, the Tower of Hera does have some branching paths and explorable areas early on, but again, the emphasis is on that linear progression upwards here. Now, we've already discussed the dungeon music in the last video, a track titled Lost Ancient Ruins, and these two dungeons also share that same piece, so we won't really get into it more aside from me saying that, boy, I like this song. But alright, let's look at the Desert Palace, our sandbox, in more detail first, before we move on to the tower. It's really cool to me how much explorable open space you get in this dungeon right from the start. The Eastern Palace had a lot of room to move around, but you still needed to tread through a foyer and two hallways first to get there. Here, it's right from the start. No foyer, the entrance takes you straight into the dungeon central room. This entire area is explorable right away, and already we're encountering some tougher enemy varieties. The Beamos here, our first encounter with one in the game, is invincible, so all you can do is avoid its laser beams. The levers will spawn out of the ground to attack and swarm you, and these guys, called Devil Ants, will burrow into the sand, pop out, and fire projectiles at you. Exploring around here, we have a lot of freedom. There are 8 doors accessible right from the start, and only one of them is locked. But there are still some obstacles to bar our progress. For example, this room at the top left has the big chest, which contains the dungeon item, but the big key that you need to open it is behind that one locked door. You also have 3 exits to take you back out into the overworld, and a 4th entrance leading into the second half of the dungeon, but that entrance is blocked by rocks, requiring the dungeon item. So we've got that tangled knot structure that I mentioned way back in Jabu Jabu's belly. Most of the dungeon is accessible right from the start, but you've got to carefully find one end to start at, then crisscross around the dungeon and unravel your progress. Among these explorable areas, we'll find the dungeon map in the northernmost room, a trap room with enemies and no reward next to it on the right, and this B-most room to the left of it with a small key. Spending the key earns us the compass and big key, which in turn earns us the power glove on the opposite end of the dungeon. I love this structure of dungeon. It feels open in how much room to operate and explore there is, but it has a somewhat defined sequence of events that you have to figure out by exploring. This many rooms accessible so suddenly may also feel like it could be overwhelming from a navigational standpoint, especially this early on in the game. But because they're all connected to one larger, memorable central room, it becomes very manageable to do. Fun even. Since everything converges off that central room, you're never really lost. You always know where you are in relation to the rest of the dungeon. Once you have the power glove, you can access the second part of the dungeon, which, like the final section of the last 2 dungeons, is just a straight shot towards the boss room. Nothing exceptional here, but I like that they ramp up the difficulty a bit. These floor tiles are basically a barrage of attacks that you have to defend yourself against. Avoiding BMOS while looking for a key in this room is a fair little challenge, and this torch lighting puzzle that moves the wall is kind of clever and caps the navigation off with a neat little spectacle. Torch lighting up until this point has been strictly for visibility, and while it's a well-known trope in Zelda nowadays, this was the first instance of it in the series being used for a puzzle like this. Zelda 1 and 2 had no such torch lighting, plus the wall moving aside like this just looks cool, let's be honest. The Tower of Hera has a totally different setup, but it gracefully introduces to us some new mechanics right away. In particular, these little gem switches which control these color-coded retractable barriers. By default, this gem switch is colored red, essentially locking you into this part of the foyer at the start of the dungeon. It's only by hitting the switch that the blue barriers will retract into the ground, but the red barriers will rise up to take their place. It's a pretty simple dungeon mechanic in theory, but it gets used in some clever ways down the road. Still, we don't get some long-winded written text tutorial, just this simple matter of learning by doing. As for that more linear structure I mentioned, this foyer room is the only instance in the entire dungeon that we get any branching paths. The rest is simply room-to-room linearity. And that's not a bad thing, by the way, just pointing out that it's different from the openness of the Desert Palace. There are simply far fewer options of places to visit here. We can get the map right away here, and we'll find 3 doors. The northern door is locked, but is a necessary detour if you want to avoid some backtracking later, since that leads to a basement room where the big key is hidden. The small key we need to access that door, meanwhile, is down the stairs behind the left door, while the right door will take us upstairs. Heading up the stairs, we'll get a series of room-to-room puzzles, which will make use of these floor tile switches, which will change the room layouts slightly by altering where the pits in the floor are, and more usage of these gem switches to alternate the red and blue barricades. Something I find neat is that there are usually multiple ways to get through these rooms, since a solution to the traversal can be found by using either the floor switches or the gem switches. It's a nice touch to give us different movement options. Another first for the series here is that sense of verticality. It's a concept I talked about a lot in my early dungeon videos for Ocarina of Time, but truth be told, the ideas have their origins here. Despite the game being 2D, they still have these rooms stacked on top of each other in universe. In the Eastern Palace, it was more of an illusion of depth, but it didn't matter matter for traversal aside from teasing you with rooms out of reach. Here though, if you fall through a pit in the floor, it will actually drop you in the room below. It's cool to see them play with this idea here this early on. You can fall all the way down from floor 5 to the basement for a secret fairy fountain, for example. And the dungeon item, the Moon Pearl, must be reached by jumping down to this platform from the room above. It's clever stuff. The enemy variety here also gets ramped up a bit, which I'm always happy to see. The difficulty curve up to this point has been handled masterfully in this game, with each dungeon so far introducing us to different enemy types. And again, they always introduce them in controlled settings. These Kodongos, which are totally not Dodongos, are first encountered here, trapped in these little boxes, before you fight them freely later on upstairs. The same goes for the first mini Moldorms that you fight, which will be trapped behind these red blocks until you release it with the gem switch. Then you'll encounter more in this room, with one of them out and about freely, but the other two needing to be released. Then upstairs, they're all over the place. These hard hat beetles, who are frankly annoying, also get introduced to us in a similar way. I hate these guys, truth be told. They are such hit sponges, and the knockback both from getting hit as well as just hitting them is absurdly far. Between these guys and the bumpers we find around here, it can be a bit tricky at times to avoid falling down below. Overall though, it's neat to see this more linear approach to a dungeon in this game already. The previous dungeons have had essentially a linear segment to them at the end, but this gameplay structure makes up the vast majority of this place, and I'm cool with that. If every dungeon was this straightforward, I think I would take issue with it, but that's not the case here. A bit of a shakeup now and then is always good, and it's cool to see us getting one big open sandbox and then one straight ascent up a huge tower back to back like this. Of course, in either case, these dungeons are still dungeons, which means they end the same way, in the desert palace after moving this wall, and at the very top floor of the Tower of Hera. Either way, we'll find ourselves being confronted by the dungeon boss. Alright, I hope you like worm enemies. First up in the Desert Palace, we have a trio of Lanmolas that serve as our dungeon boss. Simply avoid their attacks and hit them in the face to win. If I'm being honest, these guys are not my favorite boss fight. They aren't bad per se, but they do feel a bit generic and bland to me, which is too bad because the dungeon leading up to them is so great. Sandworm bosses are nothing new to us now, I guess, but this is the first time we had it in the series, and I guess later games just do it better. They're definitely more interesting than Zelda 1's Lanmolas, I'll give them that, but they don't come off as all that aggressive to me. It just feels like they're jumping around doing their thing. It's also too bad because we don't get any dungeon item integration here. I mean, technically the bow was not mandatory for the last boss either, but at least it could be used to make the battle easier. I get that the power glove isn't necessarily an item with a lot of combat utility, so it gets used more to progress through the dungeon and overworld, but maybe as an alternative, the Lanmolas could have knocked heavy rocks down into the room, which when thrown would deal massive damage or even stun them and open them up to attack. Just an idea, but sadly, we don't get to see any implementation here of the dungeon item. Oh well. It also would have been cool to see the final Lanmola change tactics or get more aggressive like the final Armos Knight, but that just doesn't happen. He gets a bit faster, but nothing like that last boss. It still just feels like he's doing his thing until he dies. That lack of item utility goes for Moldorm as well, the boss for the Tower of Hera, but the Moon Pearl would be even more difficult to integrate here. I'm not even sure how you could use it, short of just putting the fight in the Dark World, but that doesn't really affect the gameplay, I guess. The good news is that at least Moldorm does have to be fought in a pretty unique way. I mean, granted, it is still simply avoiding attacks and then hitting his weak spot, this time the tail rather than the head, but the fight actually plays out almost like a sumo match in a way. The arena has no walls around it, so if you're not careful, Moldorm will knock you off the platform and you'll land in the room downstairs. And here's one of my spicy hot Zelda takes. I love this fight. A lot of people find it annoying to get knocked down here and have to tread back upstairs, but I love that you have to be mindful of your space here. Avoiding his attacks isn't just about not taking damage anymore. anymore. It's about staying in the ring. Other battles will penalize you for getting hit with damage, but I'm the sort to stock up on fairies constantly, and with how easy a lot of these bosses are, it never really feels all that dangerous to me. But the threat of having to pause the battle altogether makes the stakes here so much higher for me. Of course, this could be my niche tastes coming into play here again. Maybe I just like the prospect of suffering too much. Though let's be honest, if that threat of falling wasn't there, this fight would frankly be super boring, especially right after the Landmolas. In fact, the Link's Awakening version of Moldorm is essentially just that, and I find it so uninteresting. That one added element of danger is what makes this fight distinct, and for me, that makes up for the lack of dungeon item integration here. In both cases, once the bosses are defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and be rewarded with the final 2 pendants of virtue, meaning we can finally obtain the Master Sword. But more on that next time. So those are the dungeons. Coming off the heels of the Eastern Palace, which had the perfect sense of navigation, it's cool to see these dungeons take on such different approaches, with the Desert Palace doubling down on open explorable space, and the Tower of Hera leaning right into that linear room-to-room progression. But before we wrap this up, a few more notes I have. I like that the entire dungeon layout for the Tower of Hera fits within the parameters of this being a real tower. It's really neat to see them committed to making it fit within a physical space like that, especially in a 2D game like this. Add in that real sense of verticality with the rooms being stacked like this, and you have a dungeon that really stands out nicely. The layout feels like it fits into the structure we see before going in. Future dungeons will borrow this element of falling to lower floors, but an enormous tower like this is the perfect place to introduce us to that idea, and it's done really well here. I love how many optional little paths and routes there are around this section of the Desert Palace. We have a set of objectives such as finding a key, then the big key, and then the power gloves, but there's all these little hallways that wind around in loops, or this room with multiple doors. Having multiple ways to reach your goals ensures that your players are more likely to find them by just exploring naturally. Although I kind of hate that this room near the top right of the map is just straight up a trap. If you wander in, the door will close behind you and you'll be forced to fight the baddies in here. It just feels kind of pointless to me. Maybe adding in one more locked door and putting a key in here would alleviate things a bit in that sense. Then you'd have 2 keys that could be obtained in any order in this section, giving a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you progress, while still having a fair amount of objectives. But that's not what we got. Instead, this room just exists. I hate it. Another note, the attacking floor tiles are super annoying, but not an outright sin, I guess. It just bothers me how a room with these will grind the pacing to a sudden halt while I stand in the corner and wait for them to just finish doing their thing, just so the door will open. I'd take a room full of proper enemies over these guys any day. Though it's still at a small scale, it's nice to see the power glove being used for dungeon progression in the Desert Palace. Even if it is technically outside the dungeon, it is still part of the overall navigation here, though it would have been cool to see even more of this. The lack of proper item in the Tower of Hera would be a major point of contention for me, if not for the fact that the dungeon has several built-in mechanics already that make the traversal interesting on its own, so I'm cool with that overall. The only item I can think of that would have fit here and made things even cooler would have been maybe the hookshot. If these gem switches controlled hookshot points that would need to be raised and lowered lest you fall down into the room below, that could have made for some neat little challenges. Think of this room in the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time, for example. But that item will come later and be put to good use. But still, even though it's lacking a proper item, the Moon Pearl will still be mandatory for the rest of the game so that we can retain our shape in the Dark World. So I'm fine with it. Overall, the traversal here is still well designed enough for me to not be bothered by all of it, at least not too much. And one final nitpick that I was going to write here was that I'm not fond of the big keys placement in the Tower of Hera. It is pretty well the same complaint that I had in Twilight Princess's Temple of Time dungeon with its boss key. It's tucked out of the way in such a spot that could be very easy to miss. I personally have never had that issue, but I can imagine a newer player making it all the way up to the top top of the dungeon and then having to backtrack for it. But then I realized while writing this that the actual boss door that you need the big key for is only on the 3rd floor, just 1 floor up from the dungeon entrance, meaning you can't actually get very far without making that detour first. So geez, they thought of everything here. That critique isn't even valid. So overall, we have 2 very different but very well designed dungeons here. A great pair of follow-up dungeons after the fantastic Eastern Palace, and a fun way for the bulk of the game's first act to play out. While they aren't my favorite dungeons in the game, I still like them both quite a lot. Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we finished off the Desert Palace and Tower of Hera, meaning we can finally start into the dungeons of the Dark World. But as usual, there's a few pre-dungeon things to get out of the way first. After we've obtained the Master Sword, we'll get a telepathic message from Zelda, who gets attacked at the sanctuary where we left her. Yep, she gets kidnapped as it turns out. So we need to storm Hyrule Castle again, this time breaking through this energy barrier and ascending up the castle tower. Now, I considered covering this section of the castle as another video on its own, just like I did with Wind Waker's Forsaken Fortress. However, in terms of level design, there isn't much to talk about here. Don't get me wrong, battling our way through the castle is very fun, and the right call for pacing at this point in the game's narrative. It feels great to cut our way through enemies using our new sword, which deals twice the damage, especially these harder soldiers. It shows us how much Link, and by extension we as the player, have grown in strength since the onset of our adventure. I really like it. It feels incredibly satisfying, but the path we take is as linear as it gets, and it's almost all just rooms of enemies, a locked door, and then a room of enemies, a door opens, rinse, repeat. The thrill comes from the feeling of triumph as we one-man army our way up the castle tower, but the puzzles and deviations in the path just aren't there. Again, this is not a complaint. Linearity is not inherently a bad thing in game design. It just means that there isn't a lot for me to discuss here. That said, at the top, we do get to battle Ganon, which is the series' first ever occurrence of Dead Man's Volley, which is always fun. I love this trope and I'll never get tired of it. After that, we're pulled into the Dark World, where we make our way to the Palace of Darkness, a sinister reflection of how we began our journey in the Light World. Very suiting for our first voyage into the dungeons of the Dark World. So with all of that out of the way, once we've paid the monkey toll, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to the Palace of Darkness, which, aside from sounding like what a 12-year-old edgelord would call their bedroom, is actually a pretty solid and well-rounded dungeon. We have lots of movement options, branching paths, and multiple routes to take through this multi-floored palace, which is awesome. While not as iconic as, say, the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time, I feel the Palace of Darkness accomplishes something similar, being the first dungeon in the game's second act. It feels like this dungeon, in the same way as the Forest Temple, is where things get real. While the dungeons of the Light World were all fairly short and not too challenging, here is where they start to get really creative with the navigation and the puzzles, and the difficulty starts to ramp wrap up. I love dungeons where you have to stop and think about what you're doing in each room while keeping the overall layout of the dungeon as a larger whole in the back of your mind. And this feels to me like the first instance in A Link to the Past where that is the case. For real, I've played this game so many times over the years, but I still occasionally hit a locked door and have to go exploring for keys in this dungeon. And I love that. The use of verticality that was introduced to us in the Tower of Hera makes a comeback here again, as well as the red-blue gem switch barriers, which make for some neat navigational puzzles, especially paired with the one-way paths in the form of these little jumps. From an exploration standpoint, having a dungeon like this where you have to always consider how you approach each room is a real treat. A quick side note as usual, but the music here gets a mix-up again. Sadly, every Dark World dungeon shares this piece, so it starts to grow pretty tiresome for me by the time we're in some of the later dungeons. But giving it an honest listen while writing this video has been interesting. It's a sinister piece, it's dramatic and dangerous. It always feels like it's building up towards a jump scare that just doesn't quite happen, which works in the context of the Dark World for me. I like the idea of danger always being just around the corner, and this song fits the bill for sure. It's just a shame that it gets so overused, especially since, for me, it's just not quite as good a track as the Light World dungeon theme. Ah well, moving on. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of explorable space here, and that is the case right from the start. The foyer room parallels the Eastern Palace with its 3 doors, but unlike that dungeon, we actually have somewhere to go beyond those 3 doors, rather than 2 of them just being dead ends. And each path is meaningful. The left path hides a key, the right one has another key as well as the dungeon map, and the center route is the critical path, taking you into the dungeon's central chambers. I like that this center route is locked initially, forcing you to explore either of these ungated side paths first. It really reinforces that idea that you have to be on the lookout for hidden stuff, rather than just blindly pushing forward. And I like that you can do these side routes in either order. Just like the Eastern Palace, this dungeon also does a great job of incentivizing exploration by teasing you with visible things that are out of reach. For example, if you drop down the bridge into this floor below, you can spot this locked door on the upper ledge, forcing you to consider the physical space around you and where you need to drop down properly to reach that ledge. Likewise, we have a handful of treasure chests tucked on ledges and balconies, teasing us by being visible but out of reach. This is the sort of thing that 2D games can do really well, since 3D games tend to have a more limited field of view. Not to say that they can't or don't achieve this, but it's something that is easier to accomplish in a 2D plane with a top-down camera like this. This is most effectively used in 2 places within this dungeon: the big chest and of course the chest in the center of this room with the big key, which combines those 2 aforementioned concepts of dropping into the room below and the payoff being you finding that key in the chest that was out of reach before. The big chest works just as well though, since you can see it on this balcony while crossing this collapsing bridge. The bridge ends with a fork in the road, but because we were teased with that treasure chest, we are incentivized to explore the left path to try and make our way over to it before heading down the right path. Which is good because that chest contains the dungeon item, the hammer. This is the game that would make this such a series staple. The hammer is a very fun item with good utility. While it did appear first in Zelda 2, that game only made use of it to smash obstacles in the overworld. It never got put to use inside of a dungeon or during combat. Here, meanwhile, we get some more real-time application of the item. The hammer makes enemies that you couldn't damage before, in particular these punnily named guys called terror pins, very easy to defeat, so there's some immediate satisfaction there. That, and we can now make progress down the critical path by flattening these obstacles. This is my favorite way for a Zelda title to use a dungeon item. You make some gameplay element like an enemy a little irritating, which the dungeon item then makes easier to overcome, and you have obstacles that can be encountered but only overcome once the item is in hand. It makes acquiring and using said item just so satisfying. It's at this point that the dungeon falls back into the same structure as the Eastern Palace. Once we've overcome and explored this large, open, and interconnected area, the next section is a straightforward linear path leading up to the boss fight. I've talked the idea to death at this point, I'm sure, but it is still worth a mention here. At least this section works to reinforce mechanics used earlier in the dungeon, with gem switch barriers, more terror pins, and barriers to flatten down with the hammer. It's a pretty short section all in all, so it isn't the meat of the dungeon by any means, but it makes the lead up towards the boss fight feel dramatic. Alright, with all of that out of the way, once we've made our way through these dark passageways, we can confront the dungeon boss. Entering the boss room, we'll come face to face with the Helmasaur King, our first Dark World boss. The Helmasaur King is simply a visually striking and imposing boss. I love this guy. He looks so dangerous. Essentially, he's a giant version of the Helmasaurs that we encountered and fought throughout the dungeon. But you know, he's a big boy. Plus, he's got a great variety of attacks. This fight at times almost starts to feel bullet hellish, but never in an extremely overwhelming way. He's pretty slow, but he'll launch these fire attacks, stomp around, and try to strike you with his scorpion-like tail. The scope of this fight is great, and I like that there's just as much an emphasis on you needing to avoid his attacks and stay alive as there is on you being aggressive and needing to deal damage yourself. It's good stuff. Unlike the previous couple of bosses, this battle has some great dungeon item integration, making use of the hammer to break his mask and expose his weak spot. It's a very fun concept that would be revisited in Wind Waker's Helmarock King, but the idea is just as satisfying here. It's great getting the visual and audio feedback as your hammer strikes chip away and ultimately shatter his mask apart. Satisfaction. From there, it's just a matter of striking that weak point to take him down. It's not the most mechanically complex fight, and honestly, you'll probably take him down pretty quickly, but the fight is satisfying and fun to do, while remaining a reasonable challenge. And for a boss fight around the early middle section of the game, that's kind of the sweet spot. It's really well done. Though I think the cluster of blade traps at the back end of the room is kind of weird and pointless. I'm not sure why they're there, since you probably won't even be in that part of the room during the fight yourself. Is the boss just flexing to us how tough he is by standing on them? I don't know. Regardless, this is a very engaging boss fight. Just the right amount of challenge for where it's placed in the game, 2 phases, and excellent use of the dungeon item. All around, very well done. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, as well as the first crystal, which releases the first of the 7 maidens. That's 1 down, 7 more to go. So that's the dungeon. Overall, while taking notes for this video during my play session, I've actually gained a newfound appreciation for how well designed this dungeon really is. It's one of those levels that I've often overlooked in favor of more iconic dungeons, but it really does a great job of balancing its ideas and having some fun little challenges. A few more thoughts before we wrap this up though. This large explorable space that makes up the first 2/3 of the dungeon is such a joy to comb through. I love how many doors are in each room and how so many sections of this dungeon intersect with one another. It makes navigation really fun, especially combining the one-way paths in the form of these little jumps and these push blocks with the the gem switch barriers introduced to us in the Tower of Hera. Although these hard hat beetles are still here, and they're as annoying as ever, but from a navigational standpoint, it's really cool. I'm sure there are people who find this room downright annoying, but I like that you have to be smart and consider not just how you traverse through the room, but also what color barriers are up in here. Though the puzzle aspect of it does get somewhat trivialized when you realize that you can cheese it all by using a bomb to trigger the gem switch after passing by some of the barricades. But still, even if you didn't figure that out, it isn't too difficult to make a pass through the previous room and enter in the other side. I also like the Goria introduced in this dungeon. Their NES counterparts aren't really that mechanically interesting, or very different from enemies like Moblins and Lizalfos, so they never really stood out to me in Zelda 1 and 2. Here in A Link to the Past, they have their own behaviors compared to other enemies. They always move in direct response to you, mirroring your movements, so it's like a puzzle and combat scenario rolled into one, and it's really satisfying to line up a shot from your bow just right and take these guys out. Speaking of puzzles, this wall moving one is another neat one. We saw a similar payoff in the Desert Palace with its own wall moving puzzle, but this time we have to shoot the eye of this Igor statue. Shooting eyeball things is sort of a Zelda staple, and is just one of those puzzle solutions that I've always known, so I may be biased here. I'm trying to reflect on how one would figure this out organically, and I guess the clue being that this is green, like the Igors that we've battled earlier. In fact, the only Igor statue that is green at all would probably be enough for players to catch on. But again, that's sort of my speculation. This is one of those puzzles that I just know, and I don't even know how I know it. I just always have. Last thing to mention, while I think overall this dungeon has an excellent sense of interconnectivity and navigational freedom, it does feel at times like it relies a little too heavily on these teleportation pads. They're not a concept I'm particularly fond of, but that may be in part due to how they're implemented here. Having so many of these, especially the ones in the critical path, makes use of the map feel a little undermined. It's weird when you find a room that looks like a dead end on the map, but it has a teleport pad connecting it to another room. I don't always mind it, like in this room below where you find the big key. I also don't mind it for convenience sake in some secret rooms, like some of the fairy fountains in the previous dungeons, but you're forced to use a couple of these during the side paths from the foyer, and again in the critical path leading up to the boss fight. And it makes the map design feel disjointed in a way that I'm not fond of. If the map had a way to mark where those teleport pads connected, then I don't think I'd be as bothered by it. Ultimately, given the scope of this dungeon, it is pretty minor, and nowhere near a deal breaker. But there are definitely spots where I feel like a staircase would accomplish the same thing, but feel more natural with the dungeon layout. It is more or less the same complaint I had with the excess of underground stairways in level 9 of Zelda 1, but not nearly as confusing here, thanks to the variety in room layouts and designs. But overall, this dungeon is still a very fun experience. While I still feel the teleportation pads make using the map a little harder to do, it's not a deal breaker by any means. The dungeon has a great multi-floor puzzle and a sense of navigation that is excellent. I appreciate how many routes there are through this dungeon, how many of these rooms connect and loop back, and how well they incentivize you to explore thoroughly. The use of treasure chests and other visible areas teasing us are great for steering you in the right direction, and it's genuinely rewarding to explore through here and collect all of these keys before heading down the path towards the boss fight. It may still not be my favorite dungeon in A Link to the Past, but while working on this video, I've grown to like it a lot. Now from here, there is a bit of flexibility in terms of dungeon order, but for the sake of this series, we'll be completing these Dark World dungeons in the game's intended order, that being the order in which these crystals are literally numbered on the map. As such, the Swamp Palace is next, but as usual, there's a few pre-dungeon things to talk about first. Since obtaining the hammer in the Palace of Darkness, a fair amount of the Dark World is open to us now. Between that and the mirror giving us the ability to travel between worlds more freely, suddenly there's a ton of secrets we can get, which is awesome. I recommend going out of the way to get the flute in particular, since that will work as the game's fast travel. I mentioned in a previous video how the game was using dungeon items to break up the progression through the overworld before, and that feeling is just as alive here as well. The Swamp Palace is our next destination, and with the hammer we can either knock down these pegs blocking this little bridge in the Dark World, as well as uncover this portal in the swamp area of the light world. So in a way, simply by exploring around and looking for new places to use our newly acquired item, we're being subtly guided towards the next dungeon. Although we can head into the dungeon right away, there isn't anything we can actually do in there past the foyer until we solve this little puzzle. In short, the two worlds affect each other. So in order to get into the depths of the dungeon in the Dark World, we need to drain the water in the swamp of the light world. Clever stuff. Once we've done that though, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to the Swamp Palace, a particularly noteworthy dungeon as it plays with a lot of notorious Zelda concepts. In many ways, this dungeon feels like a 2D equivalent or proto-version of the water temple that would take shape in Ocarina of Time. Not just because it has a strong water theme though. Many of the puzzles and traversal mechanics revolve around changing the water level in the dungeon, and of course, the dungeon item is the hookshot. The first ever hookshot in this series, in fact. God, I love this thing. What justification do I need? It's the hookshot. Now, I'm sure there are people who heard me say changing water levels and were immediately turned off of this dungeon, but let me assure you that the Swamp Palace is not nearly as confusing as many of this series' more notorious water-themed dungeons. In fact, I think the way the progression is structured in this dungeon is incredibly intuitive. The Swamp Palace features a large, memorable central room that the rest of the dungeon branches off of, meaning you always have one strong focal point to return to when exploring. Different sections of the dungeon are blocked off or inaccessible until certain conditions are met, and the big chest with the dungeon item rests at the heart of all of this, teasing you yet again. Before that though, there's a string of rooms from the foyer leading into this central room that ease you into the dungeon mechanics really nicely. First is the spot where we find the map behind a very obvious bombable wall on this balcony. We can see some explorable space beyond, and if we miss the map and end up in those sections later, we can spot that treasure chest that we passed by. So its placement is really a failsafe in a way. Then we get our first water level puzzle, initially needing us to explore to find this key, to unlock this door, to raise the water so that we can swim over to the next section. Spelled out like that, this sounds really easy and obvious, but in practice you have to stop, think, and explore. And the game makes you feel really smart when it all falls into place. The central room is next, and as I mentioned before, it will be vital to how we explore here. Excluding the door we came through and this little secret balcony area, there's 4 doors here. But here's how the dungeon smartly guides you. For one thing, the northern door is entirely out of reach and locked. The northwest door is locked as well. So with a little process of elimination, we only have 2 doors to choose from, and you can do these in either order. Consulting our recently acquired dungeon map will also show us that the door to the south leads us to a much smaller section than the southwest door. So for me, that's a logical starting point, which gives us the compass. So then it's off to that remaining western door. This path is something of a repeat of that previous water level puzzle, but made slightly more complicated by the inclusion of a gem switch corresponding to the red and blue barriers. Ultimately, our goal in this section is to get the big key, but both the lever to change the water as well as the door to the big key are obstructed by these switch blocks, so you have to alter both the water level and alternate the colored switches. To top the puzzle off, we have to get onto these ledges by jumping down from the floor above. These gem switches and elevation-based puzzles were both introduced to us back in the Tower of Hera, so they are mechanics that should be more than familiar to us by now. But it's cool to see the game introduce these 3 separate mechanics and then combine them into one puzzle like this. Again, even if it's rather intuitive to figure out, the game does such a good job of making you feel so smart when you do. As I mentioned before, the payoff here is the big key. And here's another strength of the dungeon: anticipation. See, we've been weaving in and out of the central room while exploring the dungeon, which means that we keep passing by this big treasure chest. It's been sitting there, within reach, but unopenable, again teasing us. So after completing a complicated puzzle and getting the big key, I get a real sense of giddiness at the prospect of finally being able to open that chest up. You're made to backtrack through this section with some shortcuts, of course, and the whole time that I'm doing so, I'm just filled with excitement about being able to get that dungeon item. And again, why wouldn't I be? It's the freaking hook shot. With the item in hand, we can now reach that northern door, but it is locked, so we have to find the key first, which is hidden under this skull on this ledge. I love that this room makes you use the hook shot to get that hidden key and then reach the door. There's only 3 ledges here that are newly opened up to us at this moment, but when I'm playing the game, it feels like this room was designed to be a little hook shot playground to get us acquainted with our new item, and I love that. It's just fun to use this thing. The final section of the dungeon is the path towards the boss fight. Most of this game's dungeons so far have relegated this section into a linear combat gauntlet, ramping up the tension before the boss. Here, however, the puzzle-centric navigational challenge doesn't go away. It's not that the path isn't linear per se, but there are still branching paths and multiple routes into certain rooms, meaning you have to carefully consider which path to take to actually make progress. You may take a wrong staircase and be unable to move forward, meaning you have to backtrack, figure out how to change the water level, and then move forward from there. It's clever stuff. I also kind of enjoy that this part of the path is hidden behind this waterfall. Stuff behind waterfalls is always a fun concept, but it's not too obscure since you can head into this adjacent room and see that there is a hidden path connecting to the next room over. You just have to figure out how to get there. Regardless, I love how twisting and winding these narrow corridors are. Some of these rooms feel quite claustrophobic, but there's so many little goodies and secrets to uncover, which makes it genuinely rewarding to explore through here. Once we've successfully navigated these damp, dank corridors, we can finally confront the dungeon boss. Entering the boss room, we'll be confronted by Argus. Yep, big eyeball. And if you're thinking, isn't this that mid-boss from Great Bay Temple called Wart? Well, yes it is, though this game came first, so really Wart is this guy. Semantics aside, Argus is a fine boss. He's not extraordinary by any means, but he is perfectly serviceable. I love how he looks though. He is just a big ugly monster in the best way. Initially, he will form a protective barrier around himself using these rocks, which we can use the hookshot to yank away, continuing the trend of dungeon item integration in the boss battle like we saw with the Helmasaur King, even though apparently I was the only person on Earth who didn't know that you can use bombs in that fight. Oops. Though if we want to compare this guy to his Majora's Mask counterpart, I do think that game did a slightly better job in terms of giving you a variety of options to use in combat while stripping away his defenses. Here, we can't just break apart those rocks using the sword. We've got to hookshot them individually to yank them away from the cluster and destroy them. This mechanic, though a little slow in 2D like this, is not intrusive. This is not a bad fight by any means, and there is a real satisfaction to seeing those numbers dwindle before leaving him defenseless. In some boss fights, it really feels like we as the player have to be on the defense and carefully wait for our moments to strike. Here, it really feels like the best thing to do is be aggressive. We are on the offense here, and it's up to us to break apart our opponent's defense and then strike him down. Argus has a second phase as well. Once we've removed all those defenses, he'll suddenly start hopping and charging around the room, which in a way almost feels like him panicking. He's not even necessarily aiming for us, he's just getting desperate. It's neat to see, but maybe that's just my interpretation of his erratic movements here. At this point though, it's just a matter of attacking him and not taking too many hits yourself. It's good stuff. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, the maiden is freed, and we're off to continue exploring the Dark World. So that's the dungeon. If someone sat me down and asked me to design my ideal 2D Zelda dungeon, it would probably be pretty close to this. From start to finish, this dungeon is challenging you while remaining intuitive. The first section introduces the new mechanics of the dungeon to you, and then the rest of the dungeon remixes and builds upon those mechanics while combining them with puzzle ideas that we saw in previous dungeons. That sort of thing is brilliant. It's not without its flaws though, so I'll air out some of my gripes and praises here. I appreciate how well the dungeon balances its enemy placement and navigational puzzles for the most part. I think most times it's done pretty well, where the more puzzle-centric rooms aren't quite as brimming with baddies, and the more combat-heavy rooms require a little less brain power to get through. I like that. It feels nicely balanced. But there are some times where it just feels inevitable that you're going to have to just tank some hits because enemies are cluttering at ramps, ladders, or stairs. 9 times out of 10, it is not an issue, but it's irritating when it does come up. Like, why can't I kill these guys? Even trying to bait them away from the ladder here, I'd still end up taking some damage. And it's not like I can fight them while swimming either. I also think some of these rooms could be slightly more visually distinct from each other. For the most part, it's not an issue, but there's a couple of instances that seem like they just reused a room, and I can see the navigation getting confusing for new players because of it. I also would have loved to have had a little more use for the hookshot in terms of traversal. I love that the final section of the dungeon requires it to be accessed in the first place, but I feel like there's some opportunity to have taken it farther after this point. Hey, maybe have a little platform over here in this room that we could hookshot to and avoid having to swim and take damage from these little buggers. Just a thought. There's also a few instances of very obvious keys being found in the same room as the locked door that we need it for. I personally would rather these be spread out a bit more to incentivize that more thorough exploration. Because if I'm being honest, finding this key right here to unlock this door right here, like a meter away, just feels kind of pointless to me. It's not the biggest deal in the end though, and all of these gripes are fairly harmless. So I think it speaks to the quality of this dungeon overall that my complaints feel so nitpicky. Overall, this dungeon does a lot of things really brilliantly. Those intuitive but still challenging puzzles are a joy for me. There's so many little nooks and crannies to explore and find loots and secrets, which is always fun for me. Seriously, so many of these spots and treasures in that final section are totally optional, but I love discovering them. I also love that just entering the dungeon actually makes use of the game's dual world system, and that feeling of anticipation and satisfaction with elements such as the dungeon item are implemented in an extremely effective way. The fact that I've played this game so many times and still get giddy when I find that big key and can go get the hookshot is pretty impressive. I love that this room feels like a little hookshot playground, getting us acquainted with our new item. And the fact that the boss fight puts it to use so well is a lovely bonus. While later games would take many of these concepts and run with them in even better ways, it's awesome to see these mechanics not just have their roots here, but also be so well designed on their first go. If you couldn't tell, I like this dungeon a lot. Continuing on with the Dungeons of the Dark World, we're heading into Skull Woods next, which we can now reach using the hookshot to cross the river here, and following the path to the northwest corner of the map. Usually at this point, we talk about a handful of pre-dungeon things to do, but there isn't much to talk about in this case. You can do some side quests if you feel so inclined to, but there is absolutely nothing preventing you from heading straight into the dungeon from here. In fact, the hookshot isn't even the only way to reach this portion of the map, since there's a nearby portal accessible with the hammer that we got back in the Palace of Darkness. I do want to mention though, that if you're at this point of the game and you haven't upgraded your magic meter yet, I really do recommend it before this dungeon. It's not mandatory to do so, but it is very helpful. So yeah, we just have to get to this section of the map and enter the woods themselves, which are, in a way, an extension of the dungeon. We'll get more into that in a moment, but within these woods we'll find several entrances through which we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to Skull Woods, which is the name of both this dungeon and the surrounding area outside. That may at first sound confusing, but this dungeon's overall structure actively works to blur the lines between dungeon and overworld. It achieves this by having multiple entrances and exits, requiring us to weave in and out of the dungeon and overworld in order to navigate the dungeon successfully. And that's the main focus of this dungeon. The larger puzzle box aspect here is simply navigating the dungeon itself, which is made challenging by the numerous one-way paths, the placement of keys being spread out from their respective locked doors, mostly, and the structure having several disconnected sections. This disjointed, segmented structure really makes this dungeon stand out. I think if every dungeon took this approach, it wouldn't be so interesting, but this is a really unique spin on the typical navigational formula that is really only found here, especially because it means that depending on where you choose to enter the dungeon, you may explore these rooms in an entirely different order from playthrough to playthrough. Myself, I tend to usually start the dungeon by either walking through this entrance or falling down this pit into this easternmost room. Based on the entrance placement outside, this feels to me like the general area that they want you to first enter, so that they can tease you with the big treasure chest out of reach here, which contains the dungeon item. Therefore, for the sake of making this video less confusing, we'll call this chunk of the dungeon Section 1. The map is also found nearby in that eastern room, so we can get a general sense of the overall layout before exploring even more. However, we'll quickly run into a lot of locked doors and no keys. In short, we can't get anywhere in Section 1 here aside from getting the map. It's all just teases or the promise of more explorable space, prompting us to explore outside and find another entrance. That will bring us to what I'll call Section 2, where we'll find both the big key as well as this small key, which we can in turn take back and use in Section 1. The payoff for all of that effort is the Fire Rod, which is a lovely dungeon item. It launches fireballs at the cost of magic power and is used really nicely here. I mentioned this with both the hammer and hookshot before, but I'll reiterate my point here. The reason this works so well as a dungeon item for me is that it essentially unlocks the last section of the dungeon and is used for puzzles, and by extension for progression, and it makes tough enemies which we've already encountered throughout the dungeon much easier to defeat. In particular, these Gibdos and Wallmasters, but also Bari can be killed in a single hit with it and won't split into the smaller Biri, making these enemies that were previously either a serious threat or at least a bit irritating suddenly very easy to dispatch. That alone brings an inherent sense of satisfaction to getting and using this item, and makes us as the player feel like we've grown more powerful. It's just too bad that the Fire Rod doesn't work on these hard hat beetles, because I hate these guys with a burning passion, but hey, at least you can use the hookshot to knock them into these abysses. Bye! So as mentioned, there is a third section to the dungeon, which is unlocked using the Fire Rod. Section 3 falls back on the game's old habits though. The navigational element somewhat tapers off at this point, whereas Section 1 and 2 are winding labyrinths with lots of interconnected rooms. Section 3 is a linear gauntlet approaching the boss fight. That's not a bad thing, and honestly, this dungeon structure has legitimately never bothered me. In fact, I never even really noticed that so many of this game's dungeons do this until I started making these videos. But it was admittedly rather refreshing when the last dungeon didn't do that and kept something of a puzzle element in the final section's navigation. That said, this dungeon structure already up until this point has been enough of a shakeup that a bit of familiarity in the progression structure works alright here in this final act. Section 3 is made up of 7 rooms with only a single detour, briefly having to duck into this hallway to get this key before heading towards the boss, whereas Section 1 and 2 relied on its twisting sense of navigation as a larger puzzle. This section throws at us room-to-room challenges, such as groups of enemies and a couple of smaller puzzles, including this one with arguably too many floor tiles, a nice torch lighting puzzle making good use of the Fire Rod, and the door itself being obscured by vines in this room, not unlike the curtains blocking the path to Aghanim back in Hyrule Castle. Overall, this final section works well for me, as these individual challenges are well crafted enough, and we're going to get a lot of use out of that Fire Rod. More importantly though, these two styles work well together. A larger unraveling tangled knot section that we have to explore thoroughly, spread out between two isolated sections, requiring us to keep in mind the dungeon as a larger whole, and then a more focused gauntlet that tests us with individual rooms. It strikes a lovely balance that way. With all of that said, once we've burned our way past these Gibdos and made it to the northernmost rooms of the dungeon, we can drop down this pit and confront the dungeon boss. Landing in the arena, we'll immediately come face to face with Mothula. Clearly an homage to Mothra, but alright, they're a big moth and not a giant eyeball. Wow. Mothula itself isn't so hard. They'll fly around launching these projectile attacks at you, the angle and spread of which makes them pretty easy to avoid, and if you're aggressive enough, you can deplete their health fairly quickly. Nah, Mothula isn't that tough at all. It's the room they're battled in that's the real challenge. This arena is chaotic, even bullet hellish. First off, we have the treadmill floors, which frequently changes direction, meaning you have to put extra effort into your positioning. In addition to that, we got blade traps, 34 of them, and they do start sliding around as they're known to do, but in pretty unpredictable ways. This adds a frenetic element to the fight that makes what would otherwise be a pushover of a boss a genuine challenge. If it were either the blade traps or the moving floor, I don't think it would be so difficult, but the combination is deadly. I've played this game countless times over the years, and I still have to load up on fairies in preparation for this fight, and yes, I do tend to burn through them still. While your sword does work, I find the fire rod to be extremely helpful in this fight, much the same as the bow was for the Armos Knights way back in the Eastern Palace, since it allows you to keep your distance, fire off a shot at the boss, and focus on avoiding the blade traps. But even still, this is going to drain your magic meter, so either pack a potion or be prepared to fall back on your sword. The fight overall is pretty quick, but it feels like the difficulty curve is pretty steep pretty suddenly here. The other bosses have been a gradual build-up in terms of difficulty, but this Mothula fight is a spike on that difficulty curve that I don't think any of the other bosses really match. I don't mind a good challenge. I think I've outlined that many times, but this one doesn't quite feel earned to me. Ah well. Once they're defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual. The next maiden is freed and offers us a chunk of exposition, and we're off to explore the Dark World some more. So that's the dungeon. I like Skullwoods conceptually, and it is pretty fun to navigate overall, but it isn't without its flaws either. That navigational aspect in the first two sections really is stellar though. The dungeon makes great use of these floor tile puzzles, which were introduced in the Tower of Hera, and they're used well here, even affecting other rooms, adding to that larger navigational puzzle, since some areas will initially be inaccessible until those floor tiles get activated in another room. In particular, this is used well for the item chest. Just reaching that thing is a puzzle itself, but it does feel like there is some squandered potential for this in other areas, such as this locked door in the western portion of section 2, since the next room is pointless. I hate this room. Why do you exist? In fact, this is a bit of an issue with this dungeon overall. There's a number of rooms that are meaningless to the overall progression and only seem to be there to trip you up. This wouldn't bother me if it weren't for the fact that we have to spend keys to open them up. In terms of navigation, what point is there to finding this key which unlocks this door if it just takes us back into a room that we've already combed through? It doesn't bridge section 1 and 2 or act as a shortcut or loop in the path back from anything meaningful. I don't think I'd mind this as much if the door we entered this room through didn't seal behind us, but it does, and since there is no meaningful item or treasure found here, it feels like my time is being wasted. That aforementioned pointless room especially annoys me though. There is nothing worthwhile found here, and we have to spend a key to get in here. It makes it feel like I'm being penalized for exploring thoroughly, which is typically the opposite of what Zelda games do. I think these issues would be less irritating if we weren't having to avoid wall masters constantly. In a room or two, these guys aren't so bad, but they're in almost every single room of this dungeon, and they can be frankly annoying. The fire rod somewhat alleviates that, but even still, you can be snatched by them if you aren't on your toes, and it's just a nuisance. One final complaint, I mentioned that this room might have an excess of these floor tile switches, and I don't think that would be a bad thing at all, especially from a puzzle point of view, if they didn't play the secret jingle every single time you touched one. This room almost single-handedly makes one of the most iconic sounds in the series kind of irritating. Yet, despite all of those issues, I often look back on this dungeon and call it one of my favorites in the game. I don't think it's quite as well designed as, say, the previous two dungeons, but when I'm exploring these first two sections, there's a genuine joy to having that aha moment as you pick apart the tangled knot of rooms. The dungeon demands that you explore and get acquainted with its layout, and I love that. A glance at the map would imply that this is a tall order, since the dungeon seems to lack a memorable central room, like what the Swamp Palace had. But because of the way that the overworld and dungeon are blended together like this, I would argue that the woods above serve that role, acting as a central room that the entirety of the dungeon is connected to. Between that and the rooms having memorable layouts and landmarks, navigation remains engaging and interesting, which is important since it rests at the core of how the dungeon plays. So combine that lovely exploration with how much fun it is to light your enemies on fire, and overall you have a very enjoyable dungeon. While this playthrough may have bumped this one down my own dungeon ranking, despite all of its flaws, I still like this place a lot. Conveniently, our next stop is the Village of Outcasts, just a short trip south of here. As was the case before, there isn't really much to talk about as far as pre-dungeon things to do. You don't even have to do these dungeons in this order, so really there's no quest line or anything like that. You can head straight here if you want. That said, an interesting thing I wanted to touch on was actually entering the dungeon itself. This is sadly another case of me just knowing a solution to a puzzle, but not knowing how I know it. The dungeon entrance is located under this gargoyle statue in the Village of Outcasts. You can grab the trident and pull it to break it apart and reveal the dungeon entrance. Simple enough if you know what to do, but what I am having trouble with is how you would figure that out. Again, this is one of those things that I just know, but for someone who doesn't have that prior knowledge, I can see them wandering around the village with no idea of what to do. I imagine that could be frustrating. Then again, this isn't an issue that I'm experiencing firsthand, so I could be overthinking the complexity of this, and maybe it is actually super obvious. So yeah, if you remember figuring this out, please let me know how that experience was for you. Otherwise, we may as well get right into it. Let's head into the dungeon. This is Thieves Town, a subterranean labyrinth situated beneath the Village of Outcasts. I should clarify that this naming convention is really a localization thing. In the original Japanese version of the game, the area above ground and this dungeon below share the same name, just as was the case with Skull Woods. In this case, both being roughly Village of Outcasts or Village of the Astray or something similar, however you want to interpret it. Point is that the naming convention doesn't draw such a distinction in the original Japanese version like it does in English. That said, guides and even Zelda Encyclopedia refer to the dungeon as Thieves Town, so that's what I'm going to call it for the sake of this video. Alright, let's get on with looking at the actual level design, because there's a lot going on here in this dungeon. As far as the overall layout goes, we can divide the dungeon into two distinct halves. The first being this labyrinthian section, which we'll have to carefully navigate to find the map, compass, and big key. The second section is structured a little more familiarly, with your classic room-to-room dungeon elements, but there is still a nice twist on this, as the boss room is immediately accessible but empty, and we'll find the maiden at the end of the dungeon, turning this into an escort mission, meaning we'll have to navigate back with the maiden in tow. That's a lot packed into one dungeon, and in hindsight, I'm a little surprised by just how much they accomplish here. But rewinding to that first section, it's pretty impressive how big in scope this labyrinth area feels while you're exploring here. Maybe it's because of how densely packed these rooms are, or how these walkways crisscross and overlap, and how ambiguous the navigation can feel, especially with these overhead walkways obscuring parts of the path and certain obstacles. It feels like you're crawling through a massive maze, but when you look at the map, it's really only 4 rooms. Granted, these rooms are larger than most dungeon rooms in this game, but even still, it feels so much larger than it really is, which is quite the testament to how much is packed in here. As I mentioned before, we'll find the map, compass, and big key all in this area, as well as a handful of other goodies. That big key in particular will be needed to move on to the second half of the dungeon. Worth a mention as well is how these paths twist and wind while they smartly spread these collectibles out, and how these treasure chests are often visible far before they're actually accessible. I've talked a lot already in previous videos about how this game teases you with treasure chests that are out of reach, so I won't go too deep into that concept here, aside from mentioning that it is in full gear in this dungeon. Moving on to the second half of the dungeon, this whole section is a little more traditional dungeon-esque, with a lot of interconnected rooms and multiple floors. The big door that we emerge through takes us into this hallway with 3 more doors. The boss room at the end, as previously mentioned, can be reached right away from here, but there is an additional puzzle element in figuring out how to get the boss to actually appear, with us needing to blow a hole into the floor in the room above so that light can shine down into this room below, which feels rather innocuous if you don't already know the significance of this. And that is a big part of the appeal for me as far as this dungeon goes. There's a real sense of mystery here, a lack of boss despite an area for one, a maiden locked up deep in the basement, and a lot of rooms that connect and loop back on each other, which can make the navigation feel somewhat aimless at times. If you don't take the time to get really familiar with the dungeon layout, you're going to be walking in circles or into dead ends. And I love that. I always appreciate when a dungeon asks you to understand the bigger picture rather than just ushering you from room to room. The maiden found in the basement is also important here. The overall objective is to get the maiden from here up to that boss room, and to ensure that we already have the light shining in here. That's the larger puzzle summed up. It isn't too hard to do that either. Escort missions get a bad rap, but she doesn't have a hitbox or anything like that, so it really isn't intrusive to the combat or overall experience. One final point, I appreciate that this dungeon, like the Swamp Palace, deviates from the formula that nearly every other dungeon in this game has adhered to. This time around, there is no strictly linear combat gauntlet leading up to the boss fight, so that puzzle navigation element remains strongly at the forefront of how this dungeon plays right up to the very end. Which brings us to the boss fight. Once we've guided the maiden back up here and she's been exposed to this ray of light, the boss will actually reveal himself as Blind the Thief, who was disguised as the maiden. This reveal always creeped me out as a kid for some reason. I can't explain why, but I always remember that transformation as being more grotesque than it really is. But really, he just poofs in a little cloud. So yeah, this is Blind the Thief. Blind is an interesting mid-tier boss. I think the implicit backstory of him having been a Hylian light world dweller who was corrupted and transformed by greed is pretty interesting. Bosses just tend not to get as much of a backstory as this, but Blind is hinted at as being this boss pretty early on in the game, assuming you actually talk to the NPCs in Kakariko. From a world building standpoint, I like it a lot. His actual design isn't half bad either, even if he kinda looks like an evil red cat wearing a cheap Halloween ghost costume. Still, he is undeniably unique and memorable, and not a giant eyeball. And him being an actual sentient character who speaks, rather than just a big monster, is a good shakeup. As far as fighting him goes, it's a little less interesting. It is not a bad fight by any means, but it isn't amazing either. I'd put it somewhere in the middle if I were ranking boss battles. You just gotta hit him in the head with your sword a bunch until he dies. Though things do get a little bit more interesting, as well as bullet hellish, when his head comes off and he starts blasting fireballs everywhere, and then his head regrows, which then also detaches, and then you've just got a bunch of floating heads and fireballs, and oh, it's utter chaos. Bring a fairy or two. Overall, it's a pretty short and straightforward fight, but it's pretty fun. Not super interesting as far as combat mechanics go, but the rest of it and just how fun it is compensates for that. Once defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, the actual maiden will be freed, and we're back out to explore the Dark World some more. So that's the dungeon. Overall, I like the Thieves Town dungeon, but I think it's my least favorite of the Dark World dungeons that I've talked about so far. So here's some gripes I have. You may have noticed that I didn't talk about the dungeon item at all. That item is the Titan's Mitt, an upgrade to the Power Glove, and it is placed way too far out of the way and feels frankly irrelevant to the rest of the dungeon. You do not need it for literally anything in this dungeon at all. That bothers me. It makes it feel like it was placed here without purpose. If I had it my way, I would have placed a few heavy blocks in key locations that we'd need the Titan's Mitt for, but they don't do that. Well, sorta. They actually do have two heavy blocks in the dungeon. This one, which one can be navigated around completely, and two can already be lifted with the Power Glove, so again, we don't need the Titan's Mitt. The other heavy block only obscures the doorway to this room, which is a pointless trap room. Why they keep putting rooms like this in these dungeons is beyond me, because I still hate them. This room should not exist. Back to the Titan's Mitt though, there will be uses for it outside of this dungeon, in particular for upgrading your sword, but regardless, I just wish they'd found some purpose for it here, even if it was just to open up some shortcuts, but ideally more as a way to gate progression. Again, if it were up to me, I'd place a dark heavy block here in front of the jail cell and another one here above the boss room. Better yet, I'd also throw the big key up here too and change the big door location to be the boss room itself. And for good measure, place a small key here where we would find the big key. That way you can still lock off the second half of the dungeon. It's just a few small tweaks, but I think it would go a long way to improving the overall experience while making the sequence of this puzzle aspect feel a little more sensical. And hey, let's get rid of a few of those treadmill floors for good measure while we're at it. There's just too many. Those complaints and nitpicks aside, I still really do like this dungeon, and it does a lot of things really well. As I stated before, that overall sense of navigation is stellar, and I love that it makes you really have to understand the bigger picture. I also think that the dungeon makes good use of those red and blue gem switch barriers. Only one path is really gated by them, that being the path upstairs to the light room, but there's a few other barriers that they snuck in here and there, specifically in these spots, which ensure that your route will have to differ depending on which color is up or down. Above all else though, the best thing about this dungeon is how well it leans into two concepts: exploration and mystery. These are great driving factors that rest at the core of this dungeon's essence, with that mystery being the motivation for that exploration. The path is muddled, varied, and vague, and the rooms are a jumble that at first seem meaningless, but their purposes take shape as you make progress through the dungeon and begin to understand its mysteries. It's a dungeon that makes you ask questions, like, how do I get that treasure chest out of reach? Where is the boss? Why is this maiden locked in the basement? All of these questions get answered, so it all comes to fruition, but the very fact that they show up at all is what makes this such a good dungeon. So despite a few glaring flaws, Titan's Mitt, I still find a lot to enjoy about this dungeon. No, leave me alone, I don't want to be a bunny. The Ice Palace is located at the center of the Dark World's Lake Hylia equivalent, but is surrounded by high walls on all sides, making entrance from the exterior impossible. Instead, we need to enter from the Light World by heading to this small island in the center of Lake Hylia and using the Titan's Mitt to lift this dark heavy stone and uncover this portal. Simple enough and good use of the game's dual world system. I love it when we have to use one world to enter the dungeon of another. Worth another mention as well, just as I advised about Skull Woods, I highly recommend upgrading your magic meter if you haven't already. This dungeon will be pretty reliant on using magic, and while magic drops are pretty plentiful here, the upgraded magic meter helps a lot. And hey, while we're at it, you may as well upgrade the Master Sword too before heading over, which we can do now that we have that aforementioned Titan's Mitt. Tempering the blade doubles its damage output, so it is absolutely worthwhile to do, though again, not mandatory. Alright, with all of that said, once we've uncovered this portal and returned to the Dark World, we can head right on into the dungeon. There aren't many dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series that I would rate negatively, especially from A Link to the Past onwards. In fact, there's only one dungeon in A Link to the Past that I would say I actually dislike, and that is the Ice Palace. I have a long list of grievances that I've held against this dungeon for decades, but I promise that I really tried going into this dungeon with an open mind during this playthrough. That said, the Ice Palace seems to fall short in a lot of ways that other dungeons in this game excel. It feels like someone took my long list of gripes and nitpicks that I've had about nearly every other dungeon, cranked all of those issues up to 11, then threw it into one of the game's longest slogs of a dungeon, and then threw in slippery ice physics to top it all off. I'd like to reiterate before anyone comments skill issue that I do not have an issue with games being difficult, so long as that difficulty feels fair and earned. My favorite game last year was Tunic. I streamed and completed Metroid Dread on Dread mode and completed it 100%. Twice. I even spoke very positively about Zelda 2 in this video, and the Water Temple is one of my top 3 dungeons in Ocarina of Time. Being challenged here is not the issue. In fact, challenge can make victory feel all the more rewarding. What I dislike is how this dungeon feels like it is constantly wasting my time. I keep feeling punished for exploring thoroughly, and to make matters worse, I never quite feel like I'm having that moment of payoff. Let's elaborate. The dungeon starts off fine enough. You'll encounter some ice enemies inside right near this stone tablet that hints towards using the fire rod. Then you'll be strung along around the dungeon from room to room in what is essentially a combat gauntlet. There are very few branching paths, and those few moments where they do branch out, you'll usually be greeted by dead ends, save for the critical path that they want you to follow. There's no central room to speak of that the dungeon branches off from, just a lengthy linear series of challenges, and that would be fine, honestly. I have nothing against linearity in my dungeons, and considering the last dungeon was so large, open, and exploration heavy, having a linear gauntlet style dungeon is not a bad thing. Heck, Ocarina of Time's Fire and Shadow Temples are both rigidly linear dungeons that I have praised as well. It's just that the execution here for the Ice Palace isn't quite there for me, and there are a few reasons why. Like Ocarina of Time's Fire Temple, the Ice Palace is essentially a giant loop. This worked for the Fire Temple because the loop takes you up to the heights of the dungeon, culminating in a mid-boss fight that rewards you with a useful item. Then it drops you back here for a minor detour where we use that item to get the boss key, and then confront the dungeon boss. It feels like a natural sequence of events with a very little backtracking. The Ice Palace, however, instead chooses to make you do a lap through the dungeon, teasing you with dead ends and the big chest, rewarding you with the big key at the end of the lap. However, where the Fire Temple's loop comes to a close at the boss, which was right near the entrance, the boss of the Ice Palace is at the very bottom of the dungeon, down in basement 7. So the loop comes to a close at the opposite end of the dungeon, meaning essentially we have to take a second lap and clean up whatever goodies we couldn't get on our first go through. And why is the dungeon map way down here near where that loop comes to a close, whereas the compass is here right near the start of the dungeon? It always feels weird for me and kind of illegal to get the compass before the map. Personally, I would have simply swapped these, because at this point when we get the map, we've now explored almost the entire dungeon, whereas when we get the compass much earlier on, which only marks the boss location on the map for us in this game, we have no real context for how far away that actually is because it's marking an icon on an empty space several floors away. I'd rather get the map sooner, explore the dungeon at length, and then get the compass near the end of that exploration, spurring us to head down on towards the boss. That makes more sense to me in terms of progression. The second lap I mentioned could be more forgivable if there were more satisfying payoffs offered by this pass through the dungeon as well. Like, if the dungeon item changed or simplified the way we made our way through here, say if there were shortcuts we could now use thanks to a new ability, or enemies made more easy to dispatch or bypass. You know, things that Zelda dungeons typically do. Think of the way the hookshot fundamentally changes your approach to pretty well any obstacle in places like the Swamp Palace, or even better yet, the Lakebed Temple, where it opens up shortcuts and paths around the central room. However, the dungeon item here is the blue mail. This doubles your defense, which is fine. It's quite worthwhile actually. However, I don't feel like it should have been placed in a dungeon like this one, because it doesn't really enhance the dungeon experience. It always struck me like they were running out of item ideas, so they stuck in an incremental upgrade to your stats for a second dungeon in a row. Again, I could forgive this if we didn't have to make a second pass through nearly the entire dungeon. If this place were simply structured differently with, let's say, a memorable central room and a scattered batch of keys and locked doors, then this would probably not bother me. I just don't find it fun to go through here again, fight the same enemies, solve the same puzzles, and unlock the same doors in exactly the same way that I just did 10 minutes ago, all while enduring the slippery freaking ice physics. I mentioned before that there were very few deviations or splits in the road, and there are a few gripes I have with these. I like the concept of gating rooms like this where you have to push a block to open the path, but that blocks off the other path, so you have to work around that. That's a cool concept, but it is usually meaningless because the room immediately resets when you walk out the door and walk back in. I'm sure people will tell me that this is a hardware limitation, but I can promise you it's really not. There are dungeons in the Oracle games, which ran on inferior hardware, that do this very concept better, with rotating platforms that don't reset like this, and it makes navigation way more interesting. And there is a puzzle in this very dungeon itself that also does not immediately reset, but we'll come back to that puzzle in a moment. Here though, you just push the block, walk a few feet, and then turn around and push the block again. It's more like an obstacle masquerading as a puzzle, so it feels like there was some missed potential there. And let's not forget the trap room where the door seals behind you and the floor starts crumbling beneath you. Why do we keep doing this? I have already complained about this idea at length with in several previous videos, but rooms like this really run counter to what Zelda is all about for me. You should not be penalizing your players for exploring thoroughly. Exploration is at the heart of the series. It's something you want to always be rewarding and encouraging. Alas, that's not what they do here. All of this progression through the dungeon culminates in one final puzzle. In short, we have these red-blue gem switches, which I am usually very fond of, and we need to push one of these blocks, specifically this one, down this hole to the room below, so that we can use it to hold down this floor switch and open the door. Sounds simple enough, and conceptually, I like this. On paper, it sounds great. A multi-floored puzzle that uses alternating elements that we've learned in previous dungeons and combines that with a push block puzzle. This should have been awesome. However, the block can only be pushed a single space on the game's invisible grid before it locks in place for some reason. And because of the way the game's sprite work is done here, we can't get a sense of the space of the floor below from up here before we push the block down, meaning we just have to guess at which one to push. Odds are, on a first playthrough, you are not going to know that this is the right one over here. You just have to take a stab at it and hope for the best. And if you mess this up, you can't just reset the puzzle. And because of the gem switch and barrier placement, the correct one is blocked off. So in order to do this properly, you have to go the long way around and take a third lap through the dungeon. And if you don't have a great sense of direction, you could take a wrong turn at one of those very samey looking cross-shaped splits in the road and end up even more off course. So what could have been a very fun multi-room puzzle ends up being a serious chore. But once that headache is out of the way, we can finally descend down to the boss fight. Dropping down into the arena, we'll be confronted by Cold Stare with a K. He's a giant eyeball, but cold. He's frozen, he's so chilly. Okay, so there's a lot of bosses in this game. Some of them are really fun, and some of them are Cold Stare. From a visual standpoint, yeah, he is a giant eyeball. If you've been keeping up with this series, you already know how I feel about that. As far as combat goes, this guy is more like a stress ball than a dungeon boss. You can use your fire rod to blast through his ice shell, and then you just go to town pummeling him after that. He'll split into three and launch these little ice cubes at you. How cute. But these are not hard to avoid. He is a total pushover. I really don't have much to say about this fight. He's incredibly easy to overpower at this point, and not even in a way where it's super fun or just a cool spectacle. Oh wait, I just got that cool spectacle because he's Cold Stare. Yeah. Anyways, basically you just beat him senseless. Poor guy never stood a chance. He's not as fast as, say, Blind the Thief. Things don't get chaotic or bullet hellish like Mothula. This is just a cakewalk of a fight that is disappointingly easy compared to the way that the difficulty curve has been moving. Oh well. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, the maiden is freed, exposition, and we're off to explore the Dark World some more. But more fashionably now, I suppose. So that's the dungeon. I don't like complaining this much for this long, so I'm going to try to say some good things about this place. Here goes. Some of the combat in this dungeon is really satisfying to do. These guys, called Freezors, are a genuine pleasure to melt into nothingness. And if you've got the Ether Medallion, you can freeze entire groups of these Pengators and obliterate them all with your hammer. They'll usually give magic drops too, so it isn't particularly costly to do so either. And it's just so fun. The Stalfos Knight enemies are also pretty cool. It's nice to see them show up even though they go down super easily. There are also some fun spots to use the hookshot, and I like the blue mail, despite my complaints about it earlier. It feels incongruent with the level design, but the item itself is good. This is my favorite look for Link in the game, and I will always welcome a defense boost. Overall, it is nice that they tried to go for a more linear and challenge-heavy dungeon to follow up one of the game's more open and exploration-heavy dungeons. I see what they were going for, but the execution feels like fumble after fumble. If those design elements didn't frustrate me enough, they had to top it all off with ice physics. Who doesn't love slippery ice physics? Me. I don't love slippery ice physics, not unless they're paired with a really fun sliding block puzzle. So overall, this is my least favorite dungeon in the game. It is the only one that I actively dislike, and I can't even begin to offer suggestions on improving things like I did in the Thieves Town dungeon, because this one would need to basically be redesigned from the ground up. And this video can only go on for so long. I don't have all day. There isn't another dungeon in Zelda quite like this one. And that feels to me like it's because they learned from the massive missteps taken here. So yeah, I was kind of hoping that taking a critical approach like this would change my mind. But no, I still simply do not like this dungeon. Following the game's intended dungeon order, our next stop is Mire, which is not the Swamp Palace. Different dungeon, we already did that one. As far as pre-dungeon stuff to do goes, this is pretty minimal. You have to at least have found both the Ether Medallion, which you can obtain anytime after extracting the Master Sword, and the Ocarina of Wind. The flute, which you can get by first obtaining the shovel from this kid and then digging around his hangout spot in the light world before he dies in front of you. His dad will let you keep it, and it acts as this game's fast travel system. Ideally, you would have gotten this much earlier on in the game, but this is the first dungeon in which it is absolutely needed to gain access. The reason is that the Swamp of Evil, which occupies the same corner of the map as the desert does in the light world, is completely surrounded by high walls on all sides, and therefore inaccessible from within the Dark World. Instead, just like how we found entry to the Ice Palace, we need to find a way in from the World of Light instead. Long story short, the portal's on this ledge, accessible only as a fast travel spot. So get that wind ocarina, the flute. Get that flute. Once we're here in the Swamp of Evil, it's pretty obvious from this crest on the ground that we need to use Ether here. But if you're having trouble figuring that out, there is this dude in a nearby cave who will give you a hint about it for 20 rupees. Regardless, the Ether Medallion will clear up the storm and reveal the dungeon entrance, which dramatically raises out from the ground. Epic. Love how the entrance looks like this creepy face. It's such a chilling design, and this moment is one of those little things that just stuck with me as a kid playing this game. Anyways, with all of that said and done, we can now head into the dungeon. Welcome to Mire, and oh boy, this is a complex dungeon. Last time I confessed that I really never liked the Ice Palace. It was a dungeon that frustrated me to no end as a kid, and I had hoped that replaying it with a more critical eye, as well as a better refined and trained sense of level design, would change my views of the dungeon. In the case of the Ice Palace, it did not. I still do not like that dungeon. However, a similar opportunity arose here. Mire straight up confused me as a kid, and this dungeon is so packed full of dangerous enemies and traps that in addition to just being lost, I was basically fighting for my life the entire time I was in here as a kid. My child self found this dungeon, like the Ice Palace, to be a frustrating endeavor. So again, I hoped that this revisit would potentially alter my view of this dungeon, and unlike the Ice Palace, I'm happy to say that it has. Granted, this dungeon is pretty complicated. I mean, just look at this map. But that is not a bad thing. We're into the late game now, so the dungeons should be pushing us to think harder and fight better. It's called a difficulty curve, and we're now pretty far into it at this point. Now, it isn't a perfect dungeon by any means. I think the boss in particular is another big letdown, and we'll come back to that. But for the most part, this dungeon checks a lot of boxes for me. We've got a large, important central room that the dungeon branches out from, a great variety in room designs and layouts to keep navigation memorable, and a real sense of interconnectivity between rooms, as halls and walkways overlap and crisscross. Treasure chest teases, interesting combat scenarios, well-placed red-blue gem switch barriers, a dungeon item that is actually used for progression. It has got it all. This isn't one of those dungeons with a lot of individual puzzles spread through different rooms. No, this is one of those dungeons where navigation is the primary puzzle itself, and I love that. This isn't to say that there are no individual room puzzles, there's just less of an emphasis on those compared to the bigger picture. We have a ton of explorable space almost right away, and loads of dead ends. There is an abundance of locked doors with keys strategically spread out throughout the dungeon, meaning while certain areas are gated from the start, we'll need to explore thoroughly and track those keys down. Alright, but let's rewind for a second and start from the top. The dungeon entry here leads us through a few rooms, setting the stage for the more intense combat focus that is found within this dungeon. I think it is worth mentioning as well quickly that while the game intends for you to use the hookshot here to cross this gap, you can totally cheese it with the Pegasus boots if you're doing these dungeons out of order. Before too long, we're led into that aforementioned central room. From here, things can start to feel overwhelming at a glance. We've got this large room with 7 doors ahead of us, so one might ask where to even start. But the game actually does help narrow things down via process of elimination. 2 of these doors are locked, this one is behind the blue barriers, and these blocks impede you from going left anyways, so it isn't difficult to intuit to go right first, through this nearest door. It is certainly the implication based on the layout. That said, this does not actually aid progression. It's just the game nudging you here so that it can tease you with the big chest and with this treasure chest which contains the map. Neither can be obtained right now just yet, so you're pushed back to the central room and you're going to be making a mental note of that area being important. What we're really going to need is the big key, which is found in the southwest corner of the dungeon, but we don't know that yet, so we're let loose to explore instead. All of this highlighted space is open to us right away, so we can explore, potentially collect up to 4 different small keys, and catch a glimpse of important locations and doors. With enough exploration, we should eventually make it over to this staircase, since almost every other path ends with a dead end, at least without that big key. This is the path to get said big keys, so it is important, but again, we have to explore before actually getting there, because 2 of those 4 small keys are needed here. This is where my only real complaint about the dungeon's progression comes into play. This puzzle isn't particularly intuitive in my opinion. We get a hint here to light these 4 torches to open the way forward. Okay, fair enough. And when we light the torches, we get that animation that something has changed. The same tremor effect used in previous dungeons when a wall is moved aside. The way forward is to drop down this hole and down to the floor below, where we'll find the big key. This is similar in concept to how we got the moon pearl back in the Tower of Hera. However, the key difference here is how this drop is conveyed to us visually. In every other dungeon, when you can drop off a ledge to a room downstairs, we get visual confirmation of a floor below. In other instances, when there are drops into the void that would cause you damage, it just looks like, well, a black bottomless pit. There's a visual distinction between where and when you can hop down to a floor below, or when you should not. This pit is the one exception. You're supposed to drop down here, but it looks like a bottomless void. I do not see this and think that it's where I should be going. The game has trained me to subconsciously read this as danger. A small visual tweak would fix this. Honestly, it wouldn't have been hard. I know this pit only appears after completing the torch lighting puzzle, so it could be argued that the change in the room is enough to drive you down here, but on the flip side, this is a Zelda dungeon that is pretty far into the game. It is not unreasonable to think that there are players who would not see this room in its before state at all, because they saw unlit torches in the previous room and figured out that they were supposed to light them before they even went into this room and read the hint about it. In fact, that is exactly what I did. I'm a simple man. I see torches, I light them. It's not a deal breaker for me, but it is something that does stand out. Maybe locking one of these torches behind a key and putting that key in this room would fix that, but I'm not sure. There are so many other keys in this dungeon that it could end up not working anyways. Moving on, once we've got that big key, there's a lot more we can do now. Naturally, we're going to want to run back to the eastern side of the dungeon and get the item next. After all, new items are usually some of the most exciting parts of a dungeon. However, if we're following an intuitive path, I think player curiosity is more likely to lead people away from that. This teleport pad in the room adjacent to where we got the big key will warp us over to this room, which has the big key door. Since we just got the big key, most people will probably head down this way next. Initially, I was going to put this down more as a nitpick, but I think this was very much on purpose. We'll be led downstairs where we'll immediately be halted by a puzzle that we can't solve without the dungeon item. After being stuck at this dead end, it isn't unreasonable to either backtrack, explore elsewhere, or think to yourself, I'm missing something. Either way, it actually is a pretty short route back to where both the map, if you haven't gotten it yet, and the big chest are found. So we can finally nab that item. This is the Cane of Samaria, and it is an awesome dungeon item. It allows you to temporarily make blocks that can be pushed around for puzzle solving. And if you're doing dungeons out of order, it is the secret sauce to cheesing that one puzzle that I hate so much in the Ice Palace. Here, it is the key to that puzzle that we couldn't solve downstairs, giving us the player that wonderful aha moment. From here, A Link to the Past somewhat falls back on the same structure that many of its earlier dungeons have used. We've gotten this large open explorable space, and now we have a linear, challenge-filled section leading up towards the boss fight. This is still pretty fun. It's not super combat heavy, but there's a few more puzzles using those red-blue gem switches and barriers, which I'm always fond of. That said, it would have been cool to find a little more use for the Cane of Samaria in this section, but I'm just nitpicking at this point, I guess. With all of that said, once we've made our way through here, we can confront the dungeon boss. Of all the bosses in A Link to the Past, Vitreous is definitely one of them. Hey, who left my cold stare out to thaw? Okay, jokes aside, Vitreous, besides having an admittedly pretty cool name, is even more guilty of the same crimes as the last boss. He is, to put it simply, completely uninteresting. He's just a pile of giant eyeballs and a puddle of chew jelly. He has two basic attacks: launching eyeballs at you, which you can easily beat back with your sword, and this lightning strike attack, similar to an attack that Aghanim does. Of course, he only aims straight forward, so these attacks will always occupy the middle third of the room, meaning you can literally just stand off to one side and spam sword swipes. After a while, he'll come out of his little puddle for a second phase, in which he'll charge at you directly, but he's slow and moves in a very predictable way, so you can just continue to stand in said position off to the side and continue mashing the B button to slash away and win this fight. No dungeon item required, no skill required either. Overall, I like the boss battles in this game. There's a great variety, but at this point with Vitreous and Cold Stare back to back like this, it really feels like they were running out of ideas, especially when Argus back in the Swamp Palace already did this whole giant eyeball with smaller things protecting it concept better. And that fight managed to make use of the dungeon item. This battle does not find any use for the Cane of Samaria at all. Imagine if they had used the Cane's abilities to, say, create moving platforms on a track, which gets put to use in the next dungeon, and built a boss arena around this concept with gaps you'd need to cross in order to avoid his attacks, or even to deal damage yourself. That could have been a great use of the item and a far more dynamic fight. Instead, we got this. I timed it. I literally stood in this corner mashing B for literally less than a minute, and that was the entire fight. Ugh, we can do better than this. We have done better than this. But unfortunately for Vitreous, this boss is simply uninteresting. Kudos to whoever at Nintendo thought of the name Vitreous though, that's pretty cool. Once he's defeated, not that he ever stood a chance, we'll get our heart container as usual, the maiden is freed, also as usual, and we're headed towards Turtle Rock next. So, that's the dungeon. Despite having a total letdown of a boss battle, there is a lot to appreciate here about Misery Mire. While the dungeon has a winding, twisting feel, I do appreciate how surprisingly well it conveys its objectives to you. It lets you wander around almost aimlessly for a bit so that you can see where all the points of interest are. It lets you see the big treasure chest where the dungeon item is, the doors you need the big key for, and even a handful of other treasure chests. It gives you all the pieces to the puzzle and then lets you run loose and put things together yourself. I think that is really what makes this dungeon great. It certainly isn't a perfect dungeon. There's that one puzzle that could be improved with some minor visual tweaks, and the compass is placed in a bit of a weird spot for me, but that's all pretty forgivable. The compass only shows us where the boss location is, and the paths towards the bosses in this game are often intuitive enough for me to say that the compass is hardly ever needed, if at all. Plus, if you're making a conscious effort to be thorough in this dungeon, it isn't actually difficult to get. It's just a minor detour. It just also doesn't feel like it was placed with much significance in mind. I was initially going to complain about this locked door as well, but after a bit of thinking, I'm retracting that complaint. I noticed that I finished this dungeon with an extra key in my pocket because I never unlocked this door, because I never had to, but I quickly realized that this is indicative of the fact that there are multiple methods of obtaining the dungeon map. I like that. The dungeon letting you do things in more than one way is a good thing. If you've got these blue barriers up, then you can choose to spend that key here and get the map that way. Or if the barrier is down, you can head in from either the big chest room or this northern room and save that key. So depending on which barriers are up or down, the map is still obtainable either way. You just have to think around those barriers. I like that. So I didn't spend the key this time, but if they had left this key out, then it could make getting that map a serious pain for some players, as they'd have to travel to either of these two locations on nearly the other side of the dungeon to activate the switch and bring down those barriers. Rather than sending you way off the path, they built in a contingency. That's just smart design that I didn't even catch at first. So there you have it. While this is not my favorite dungeon in A Link to the Past, I think it gets pretty close up there. There's a few minor complaints, but overall, Mire gives you a large, sprawling, exploration-focused dungeon experience, and pairs it with a pretty nifty dungeon item. The biggest thing holding this dungeon back from greatness is a very lackluster boss battle, but even then, I like this dungeon a lot. We've reached the penultimate dungeon of A Link to the Past, the excellent Turtle Rock. So, it's back up to Death Mountain we go. And joining me today to take you through this great dungeon is my friend Pixel Fusion.
Man, I love this dungeon. Hey Daniel, thanks for letting me join you on this episode of your show. I'm Pixel Fusion and a friend of the captain here. He's shown up a few times on my channel. Anyhow, Turtle Rock is an awesome dungeon. The environment, difficulty, and unique mechanics of it always stuck out to me. Plus, a few hidden goodies you can get with careful use of the Mire out on the cliff face. A Link to the Past is probably my favorite Zelda game, and definitely the one I grew up with as a kid. I spent way too many nights hanging out with my best friend playing this game until dawn.
Gaining access to the dungeon isn't too difficult. Like the entrance to Mire, the required medallion is marked by a crest at the dungeon entrance. This time, we need Quake, which can actually be obtained much earlier on in the game, but is only required now. You're also going to want to get yourself the Ice Rod, if you haven't already for some reason. And if you're doing dungeons out of order, you will want to have gotten the Cane of Sumaria from Mire and Fire Rod from Skull Woods before even thinking about tackling this place. Worth a mention as well, while you can pretty well cross over this section of Death Mountain right away and go straight to the top, there's a fair amount of goodies to get around the Death Mountain area in both worlds. So I usually recommend giving these caves a thorough sweep while you're here. None of that is required per se, but I do find combing through all these caves pretty fun, and the goodies you can get here are pretty nice, so it's worthwhile if you ask me, just not mandatory.
If you don't mind me throwing in a little extra regarding the mountain here, it looks awesome. The music is intense. It's also the only spot in the game where you encounter Lynels, who look really cool in this game compared to their Zelda 1 counterparts. Basically, all of the graphics in this game, the sprite work and classic pixel art are a real joy to look at, be it from the subtle lighting when you enter a dungeon at the door, to the landscape you can see from the mountain in the light world. Its appearance in the dark world though, with this pulsing light, it's fantastic.
A bit of maneuvering between the game's two worlds will be needed here, as you can only get up to this ledge to open the dungeon by warping in from the light world, just like with the last two dungeons. It's a small touch, but I appreciate that the game makes use of its dual world system so nicely. Alright, once we've used the Quake medallion up here, the entrance will be revealed, and we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to Turtle Rock, the location of the final crystal and the penultimate dungeon of A Link to the Past. You can probably guess why this dungeon is named Turtle Rock, because this rock is it's a turtle. This guy is a bit like a turtle too, like a rocky turtle guy. Aside from that, the name has little bearing on anything else going on here, but it is pretty memorable. More memorable than just naming it whatever temple. Aesthetically, this dungeon isn't anything to write home about. It uses the same tile sets that a lot of the various caves that we've explored in both Hyrule and the Dark World alike do. It isn't a bad look per se, and this dungeon does have a lot of standout and memorable set pieces and mechanics, but you'll have to look past the same brown rocky walls that we've seen already.
Well, there is that section with the lava and the pipes. Those are tile assets I don't think that are used anywhere else in the game. You are right though, that in some aspects, it looks more like an expansive cave. Those I-beam things on the wall return, and have always creeped me out. You gotta love that sound effect though.
None of this is to say that Turtle Rock is bad. I would have liked for it to be more visually distinct, yes, but in terms of gameplay, this is an excellent dungeon. Interestingly, Turtle Rock actually shares a lot of similarities in terms of structure to the Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time. That 3-act structure? Check. Moving platforms over bottomless death pits? Also check. Spike floors, stalfos, a dramatic ride leading up towards the boss chambers? Check, check, check. It's not like the Shadow Temple is a one-to-one copy of this place though. Obviously those aforementioned aesthetics are not even close to being the same, but I can't help but wonder if some creative inspiration for the level design of that dungeon was rooted here.
You could be onto something there, Daniel. There were a lot of creators who share work between the two games. And while Aonuma was brought in as a dungeon designer for Ocarina, he may have drawn a lot of inspiration from this game. Clearly, the dungeon formula expanded there, and as we all know, would become a staple until Breath of the Wild came around. Still, I miss the 2D games like this. I hope we get more of them in the future.
A Link to the Past really has done a wonderful job of balancing its dungeons between linear, gauntlet-style dungeons and large, open, central room-based exploratory dungeons. And that delicate balance is a good thing. What I find impressive about Turtle Rock is that it really manages to blend those two styles together nicely via that 3-act structure I mentioned before. Rather than leaning all the way into one or the other, this dungeon can be neatly sliced into 3 distinct acts that each, when played together as one dungeon, act like a linear sequence. You have to start in this area, complete these tasks, then move on to the next area, complete objectives there, and so forth. However, when we examine those 3 areas individually, they could each be seen as open exploratory dungeons in their own right. This is the central room for this chunk of the dungeon, and this is the central room for the next chunk of the dungeon. If this is confusing, think of it this way. Mire is one of those open exploratory dungeons with an important central room. Now imagine if after completing all of this dungeon, rather than reaching the boss room, you went downstairs and there was just another dungeon with its own central room, and you got to explore again. That's what it feels like we get here. Granted, these sections individually are all much shorter than Mire was, but in terms of structure, it fits, even if only loosely, and when all 3 sections are combined, the length of the dungeon is appropriate. There's a fair amount of that backtracking and crisscrossing within each section as you explore, but you likely won't have to backtrack to a previous section. But let's rewind for a minute and start at the beginning. The dungeon foyer will start us down this hallway and into the first floor's central room. We won't be able to even reach this central room until we figure out, with some experimentation, that we can create moving platforms with the Cane of Sumaria. From the central room, we have 5 doors ahead of us, with one of them being locked. This kicks off what is essentially our first objective here, finding the key so that we can make progress further through the dungeon. We'll also find the map and compass around here.
I gotta say, I really like the use of the Cane of Sumaria here. Fundamentally, it just makes blocks that you can push around, which really isn't useful outside of that one room in the ice dungeon. You can also turn it into a set of projectiles by hitting it again, but that isn't very useful and you may as well just use the fire rod then. The choice to include its use of making platforms is pretty neat though, and also does a good job of consuming your magic if you spend too much time going back and forth between the rooms. Always bring some green potion with you, or maybe even a blue one if you can afford it.
Green potion is definitely helpful, as even though there are magic drops around here, they don't respawn unless you leave the dungeon entirely. So if you're exploring thoroughly and looking for that aforementioned key, you may accidentally grab these before you need them and end up running short on magic power. That key we need is tucked here in the northeast corner of the dungeon, requiring us to solve this time-based torch lighting puzzle, all while riding this platform, followed by some spike traps. Once we've nabbed that, we can cross back through the central room and pass through that locked door and towards the dungeon's second act.
Don't forget about that last room with the chain jumps. They're adorable. Also, kind of strange to see in a Zelda game. But these early titles had a few instances of Mario enemies in them. Manhandla from Zelda 1 for instance, the chain chomps here, and of course in the next game, Link's Awakening. There were more than a few obvious ones around. Anyhow, these guys are cute. I wish I could break their chains.
This does make me wonder, between the chain chomps, the fire bars, the hokuboku, along with the generally more cave-like architecture here, if this was one of the earlier dungeons that they designed for the game, and if they were at the time borrowing a lot of assets or at least ideas from the Mario series. It's a curious thought, but Zelda games tend to throw some of those earlier developed dungeons in closer to the end of the game for some reason. Still, that's speculation on my part. Moving on, we can head down to Basement 1.
Ah yes, this next part is fun. There are these cool lava tubes that you have to travel through, and while I think their layout is a bit nonsensical, it's fun to watch the camera track your movements through them. If this were a 3D game, you might easily get lost being stuck in a first-person perspective mode. But in the 2D world, we instead get this cool sliding effect. Also, it reminds me of some levels in Mario 3, where you end up moving through large jumbles of pipes. I'll stop bringing up Mario now.
Navigating these tubes offers a neat effect. They're the perfect example of the layout feeling winding and twisting while being not too difficult to navigate. They limit how many tubes you actually have access to at any one given time, and they each have a defined entrance and exit. So what ends up happening is that the layout looks and feels confusing, but we're ushered to the correct area fairly automatically. It's a bit cheeky on the developer's part, but making your way through this area genuinely makes me feel smart for having gotten through it, even though I was just along for the ride. Our objective here is getting the dungeon item, found in this room at the southernmost end of the dungeon. But to get it, we'll need to get that big key at the center of this tangled mess of tubes. With that in hand, the dungeon actually tricks us a little, forcing us outside in order to actually reach that spot with the big chest.
I mentioned that there are sections outside on the cliff you can use the mirror to return to the light world. I always love it when sections of a dungeon return to the overworld. Doing so can get you a piece of heart and a magic refill just in case you need it.
With the mirror shield in hand, it's just a matter of navigating to the next staircase and heading into the dungeon's third section. As has been pretty well the case with most dungeons in this game, the next area is a bit less exploratory and a bit more linear, which is totally okay. The challenges here feel a little less about navigation and more about testing your mettle and making use of our new item. If you missed that mirror shield and somehow made your way down here, then you probably won't get far with all of these laser eyes shooting at you. We get another section that makes use of the Cane of Sumaria, a minor detour for a small key in which we need to orient Link appropriately to block these lasers, and then a room that is essentially one massive gem switch puzzle. Gosh, I love this mechanic. All of this culminates in this rather dramatic ride over the abyss and towards the dungeon's finale. I know this is only a small moment, but there's something about this ride through this room that always stuck with me. It's brief, but it rightly feels like it's building up towards something big. Atmosphere is such a big part of the dungeon experience, and it's on full display right here. With all of that said, once we've crossed this abyss, we can confront the dungeon boss. Entering the arena will come face to face with Trinix. And man, this is one of my favorite bosses in the game. Trinix has a great visual design. He's large and imposing and has this three-headed thing going on. And his rocky carapace dino turtle thing is frankly unlike anything we've seen in Zelda bosses since. It's almost too bad that we've never gotten a reimagining of this guy, despite so many other 2D bosses becoming staples in the series going forward. If we can can get 50 iterations of Goma, where is our 3D version of Trinix? In terms of combat, Trinix works as a bit of a type matchup style boss. One head shoots fire, and the other one shoots ice. And since we've come equipped with both our own fire and ice rods, we have to use those opposing elements to stun him and deal damage. It's unfortunate that the mirror shield doesn't really come into play here, but I'm completely willing to overlook that for just how fun the boss is on its own.
I find it interesting that you need magic to fight this boss, and if you happen to run out, well, it's game over. This boss is also the first Zelda boss to integrate fire and ice themes, something that would show up again in later games. It's a cool fight. It reminds me of Gleeok back in the day, but mainly because of its multi-headed aspect. Once you manage to take out the 2 elemental heads, the shell breaks off, leading to round 2.
The second phase here will have him go into what I call snake mode. His behavior here is pretty similar to the likes of Moldorm, but his weak point isn't his head or tail. You've got to aim instead for his midsection, making it much more difficult to keep your distance. You've got to engage far more closely and get into riskier positions in order to land a strike on him successfully. This part isn't the most challenging, but it still holds its appeal. If this were the entire battle, I think it would be a straight up fail from me, but this being only one of 2 parts makes it far more acceptable to me to have it be this straightforward. We already had to problem solve in phase 1, so phase 2 can be more about reflex. It works, and as I mentioned before, this truly is one of the best bosses in the game.
This seems like a good time to bring something up. The boss is immune to arrows in both phases, which was possibly done to prevent it from dying from a single silver arrow. You could have those at this point, and as far as I can tell, they will one-shot all monsters except for Ganon, from the beefy Hinoxes to Lynels and even other bosses. I once did a run where I got the dungeon items from the Dark World, but left the bosses intact except for levels 5 and 6, as those are the ones who trigger unlocking the big bomb. Once I had silver arrows, I went back and tested it on the bosses. And if they could be hurt by arrows, they would always die in one shot. Sure, you might have to break off a mask with the hammer first, but the arrow itself would slay them when it hit their weak point. Since Trinix is immune to arrows though, you'll have to take him out with your sword as intended.
Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container, as usual. The final maiden, Zelda herself will be freed, and all we have left to do now is head towards Ganon's tower. So that's the dungeon. Overall, Turtle Rock is an excellent dungeon. It has a great sense of delving deeper and deeper into the dungeon depths, with that boss chamber being far removed from the entrance, unlike many other dungeons which place it near the central room, and therefore not too far from the entrance. Here, that journey to the boss room is a trek, and it makes it feel more dangerous because of how much we have to endure just to get there. Structurally, we have several well-crafted exploratory sections that make up the components in a larger linear dungeon, and then it manages to cap it all off with one of the game's best boss battles. I adore Trinix. He's a genuine pleasure to take down. I really don't have a lot of complaints here. I suppose I would have liked to see more use for the mirror shield, but even then, that complaint feels like I'm stretching it, as it successfully makes obstacles that could give you serious trouble earlier in the dungeon much easier to overcome. The only opportunity to use it more would perhaps have been if it was used during that boss fight. Even then though, that concept of deflecting elemental attacks would come to fruition in later games. But with the way A Link to the Past's items and controls are set up, I can't see that type of battle working particularly well here. So even though it would have been cool, I don't really think it is enough for me to dock points here.
I wouldn't be surprised to find out that they intended a deflection mechanic with the boss, similar to what we see in Ocarina of Time versus Kotake and Kome. The series' history has always been plagued with limitations of the system, and that of course has always hampered the vision of the creators. Trinix stands out to me simply because you need magic, the Fire Rod and the hidden overworld Ice Rod to defeat them. Usually you just need the dungeon item, either that dungeon's one or a past one, and of course your sword. This really makes me wonder if they did intend for breath deflection mechanics.
I was also going to complain initially that since this dungeon makes such good use of the Cane of Sumeria, that it does highlight some missed potential in Misery Mire. Perhaps a rework could have made it so that it was placed as the dungeon item here. We could have 2 items even, why not? The Spirit Temple does it, but again, some serious reworking would need to be done since you need that cane as early as the first room here. So really, this is a shortcoming of the prior dungeon not using its own item as effectively as it could have, rather than anything wrong with Turtle Rock itself.
Perhaps they could have included this spot in Misery Mire in order to demonstrate how the rod could create platforms. It's a little odd that one of its core functions is missing from the dungeon it was introduced in. I'd argue that its most useful function is actually found in the dungeon before you get it.
The only thing I would say that leaves something to be desired is the architecture. As mentioned before, these cave walls are the same tiles used in regular caves, meaning that there isn't a lot aside from the dungeon mechanics that sets this place apart visually. But that gets so quickly overshadowed by how much other great stuff is going on here. So overall, Turtle Rock, well, rocks? It rocks? I'm sorry, that was my bad. I couldn't resist. Dad jokes aside, it is genuinely a great dungeon though.
It's one of my favorites. I like the Tower of Ganon too, but it's kind of a rehash of everything from the game. I look forward to your video on it.
And hey, before we sign off, I would like to take a moment to thank Pixel Fusion for joining me on this video. It's always a pleasure to chat with a fellow enjoyer of A Link to the Past. You'll find links in the description to his channel so you can head on over that way and catch some more great Zelda content.
Oh, of course, Daniel. Thank you for having me. I really do love this game. And unlike those early 3D graphics, pristine pixel art always holds up well. Visually, every aspect of this game was crafted with care, love, and attention to detail. Truly a marvel that continues to stand the test of time. If your fans happen to be interested in what I'm doing over on my channel, lately I've been creating lists of mysteries in Tears of the Kingdom, and trying to make sense of things that don't quite add up. There is a lot, I don't need to tell you that. All the same, I hope you all have a good day, be safe, and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.
We're into the end game now. All that's left is Ganon's Tower. As far as pre-dungeon stuff to do goes, well, there isn't any. Ganon's Tower is pretty much right beside Turtle Rock, only a few screens over, so it's simply a matter of walking over there. However, this is a good time to round up any collectibles, such as heart pieces that you're missing, if you feel so inclined. I also recommend nabbing yourself the silver arrows and final sword upgrade if you haven't yet. It isn't required for the dungeon, but you will need it for the final boss fight. There is an opportunity between the dungeon and your showdown with Ganon to grab it if you'd rather not take the detour yet, so it is not required per se, but the extra firepower does really come in handy here. And that's about it for pre-dungeon stuff this time. So the maidens and Zelda will use their power to dispel this barrier, and for the final time in A Link to the Past, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to Ganon's Tower, our final dungeon in A Link to the Past. There's a lot going on in this place. It is easily the longest and most difficult dungeon in the entire game, as it should be. This is the finale, so it should be putting all of our skills to the test. Not unfairly. It is challenging in a reasonable way that respects the idea that maybe you've gotten better at this game since you started. In some ways, it reminds me of Spectacle Rock in Zelda 1, but far less of a slog to get through. Put less politely, this is what Spectacle Rock could have been if it were actually fun. The dungeon is massive too, a whopping 8 floors, though the bulk of the dungeon is concentrated on the first floor, which is a winding, twisting, interconnected pile of confusion. There's 25 rooms here, many of them being quite large, and with branching paths, loops, teleport paths, and multiple routes. As for upstairs, it's a linear straight path up towards the boss fight, but they block off access to most of it initially, with the big key door ushering us downstairs first, so we'll come back to that later on. There's no one set path on floor 1. Instead, it's that sort of raw, open exploration that I love so much, but without a central room to memorably tie it all together. But you know what? I am totally okay with that. I've been critical of other dungeons lacking that in the past, since it tends to add a sense of cohesion to the exploration, but I would argue that it works here so well due to the trial by fire feeling that we find ourselves enduring here. Yes, it's a big winding maze, but it's also meant to keep you constantly moving. The objective here is to find our way to this room so that we can drop down to basement 1 and get ourselves the big key, which in turn will give us the dungeon item, as you'd expect, and unlock access to everything upstairs. Sounds simple enough, but finding your way there is a real task if you don't know where you're going, just due to how large and cryptic this place is. But with enough perseverance, you should be able to get there. It just may take you a bit. Again, in many ways, it resembles level 9 in Zelda 1, especially when you factor in the sheer abundance of teleport paths down here, sort of like level 9's underground passageways. In other dungeons, I'm not really that fond of these, since I feel like it muddles the sense of navigation and makes it harder to accurately draw a mental map of this place. And given the huge quantity of them here, you'd think I would be complaining. However, what this place does with them is notably different from what places like the Palace of Darkness did. Rather than building them into the navigation overall, the teleport paths are really isolated to being essentially a puzzle mechanic. They don't connect any rooms outside of the puzzles that they make up. So you'll go through 10 in a row to push through this little puzzle, but then outside of that, you won't really find them. And they don't factor into the progression outside of that scenario. I don't love puzzles that are just entirely trial and error like that, but it also isn't an outright sin or something that's annoying enough for me to really dock points. Speaking of those puzzle ideas, something this place notably does is intentionally not introduce new dungeon mechanics, instead throwing in and repurposing just about every puzzle mechanic introduced to us in previous dungeons, and testing us on our skills. The one exception to this is the invisible bridges, which did not feature in any prior dungeon. However, there is a single one of these bridges in a cave on Death Mountain, out in the overworld, so even that idea isn't wholly original here. So this acts as a sort of review of the adventure up until this point. The game has laid out the foundation already, and it's up to you to recall what you've learned during the game and apply those learnings here. Some may bemoan this, but if you ask me, this is exactly what a final dungeon should do. This is the final exam. Take your teachings and push your players to their limits without being too frustrating. That's probably the reason the dungeon item here is simply the red mail, another defense upgrade. Rather than introduce new ideas, it can double your defense yet again, and focus on those remixed puzzles and boss fights. Yes, boss fights. In addition to a lot of returning puzzle ideas, the dungeon includes rematches with the first 3 dungeon bosses, which were previously fought in the Light World. They are all much easier to defeat now. The Armos Knights are down in basement 1 and reward us with that big key, and then the Lanmolas and Moldworm are upstairs, acting as barriers during our ascent up towards the actual boss. Lots of Zelda games feature boss rematches. Wind Waker most shamelessly in its own Ganon's Tower, but I think it's done best here, since they don't strip you of any weapons or anything of that nature. Instead, you go toe-to-toe with bosses that previously may have given you a hard time, and now you get to absolutely trounce them. If you've gotten all the sword upgrades, silver arrows, hearts, etc., you can utterly demolish these guys in mere seconds. It's one of the game's clever ways of subtly showing us how much stronger we've gotten during our adventure, and it is frankly super satisfying. After finding the big key, we head upstairs towards the boss, but getting there will be a challenge. This section is a long, linear path taking us farther and farther up the tower. Actually, not unlike the Tower of Hera, which occupies the same space in the Light World, though this place concerns itself a little less with fitting physically in the confines of a tower than that dungeon did. Regardless, this section of the dungeon is less about exploring and navigating a huge area like downstairs, and instead more focused on interesting combat scenarios, maybe as a callback to the upstairs section of Hyrule Castle, which also culminated in our battle against Ganon. There's not a lot to talk about in terms of level design in broad strokes, but as far as progression goes, each room is going to make you work for it. And while you could chalk this up to just a gauntlet of rooms with enemies, then more rooms with enemies, and etc., I genuinely feel they do a good job of making each room interesting here. You're not just fighting wizrobes, but wizrobes on treadmills and invisible bridges, moblins on collapsing walkways, or Zazaks on ice floors with spike traps and Beamos. They're going to throw everything at you here. It's great, a real challenge, but never overwhelmingly so. Even those aforementioned boss rematches get a bit of a shake-up too, whether it be added projectiles or a different arena. This isn't to say that there are no puzzles in this section. There are, just as there are downstairs, but they limit them to individual room puzzles, like requiring you to light torches to open the door, rather than those expansive multi-room navigational puzzles found downstairs. So the pacing always feels like it's driving you onwards. Genuinely, the dungeon remains exciting right up until the very end. So after climbing up the tower to the very top, we can finally confront the dungeon boss. Entering the boss chamber, we'll be greeted by the ever-joyful Ganon. Remember how I said this dungeon doesn't do much in the way of introducing new mechanics? Well, that goes for this boss as well, which itself is a rematch. The battle against Ganon plays out the same as before, the classic dead man's volley. Simply deflect these energy balls back at him with the Master Sword and avoid his other attacks. This iteration of the battle will be more challenging than the first time we faced him, as he'll create a pair of clones to attack you as well, though they're not too hard to manage overall. You won't be able to defeat the clones, but you can deflect their attacks back to the real Ganon to deal some additional damage. People roll their eyes at me when I talk about Dead Man's Volley and loving this battle mechanic in Zelda games, but Ganon really was the first instance of it in the series, and well, to be honest, I really never get tired of it. It requires a level of timing and precision, and puts you squarely in the defensive position. Plus, there's always something satisfying about turning an enemy's attack back on them. Aside from that, Ganon should go down quickly enough. Perhaps too quickly if this were the end, but it is not. Once he's defeated, we'll see the spirit of Ganon rise up. Ganon here was not the big bad. He was merely a bunshin of Ganon's. The Demon King will flee from the scene, with the hero in pursuit, leading us to the top of the Pyramid of Power, the same spot we found ourselves standing after the last time we fought Ganon, in fact. The game offers you a bit of breathing room here. If you need to gather any resources such as potions or whatnot, now is the time. Or if you haven't yet gotten those silver arrows, do it now. Otherwise, we can drop inside and confront the true final boss of the game. This battle is awesome! Oh, but first, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the music. It's great. There's this constant, almost militant beat to keep up the energy, dramatic, droning brass, and this constant sense of rising and falling tension. It's a brilliant piece for a boss fight, and leagues better than the usual boss theme. Fares pretty well on original hardware, but later games would iterate on this piece, re-recording it with proper live instruments, which only shows just how strong that original composition is. It's a great climactic piece that fits the game's finale to a T. Alright, on to the actual battle. Ganon attacks with a great variety of moves, all centered around these fire bats and his trident. He breaks the stage, permanently altering it for the rest of the fight, and even has 2 phases. Phase 2 also has him turn invisible, forcing us to light these torches in order to even see him. This opens up the opportunity to attack and use silver arrows. All the time, he's zipping around and relentlessly firing back at you. You have to be on the ball constantly, avoiding his moves, monitoring your own health and magic, and waiting for the right opportunities to strike back. Mind your footing too, as slipping off the stage will send you to the room below, forcing you to leave and restart the battle. So you have to keep track of your positioning to make sure you stay in the fight. I love this battle. In many ways, it feels like it recontextualizes and fixes the issues I had with the Ganon battle in Zelda 1. He still turns invisible and teleports around the stage, but rather than having to stab around blindly and just hope you land a hit on him, instead they turn this into almost a mini puzzle within the battle itself, making use of our inventory. It's great, and even after all of these years of me playing and replaying this game, I still have to bring fairies into this fight with me. This Ganon battle is among the best of the best in this series. I wholeheartedly believe that. It is a mechanically sound fight that ends the game with a bang. It is truly fantastic. After destroying Ganon, we get a moment of just silence, with light shining into the room from this newly opened doorway. Inside, we'll find the Triforce, and after listening to its essence speak to us, we can make a wish, a simple wish, to undo the damage inflicted upon Hyrule. Thus, our adventure comes to a close. Credits roll, and we get to see Hyrule at peace once more. And that is until everything just inevitably gets messed up again in the next game. So that's the dungeon, and the end of A Link to the Past. Overall, Ganon's Tower serves as a great finale to the game. It reviews everything we've learned up until now and puts it all to the test, making victory feel earned. The rematches found here show how much stronger we've become, as those previously hard bosses can be killed in 1 or 2 hits, depending on how many sword upgrades you've managed to nab for yourself. The overall dungeon structure feels like the 2 sections of Hyrule Castle combined into 1 dungeon, rather than played separately, with the first section being a big, exploratory, winding mess of rooms that we have to comb through, and the second being a linear gauntlet. This, of course, has been the structure that most dungeons in the game have followed, but it's arguably done best here. The dungeon will challenge and push you in the best way possible, though at times it does feel a little too unforgiving, not so much in terms of the combat, but rather in terms of how many doors seal behind you, meaning if you miss certain things, such as the map in my case, there'll be a lot of retreading to get it. I don't mind having so many rooms loop back and connect in on each other. I think that is great, but it sucks to realize that I missed something after I've chosen one of 2 paths at a fork in the road. Simply letting me walk back the way I just came would alleviate this, rather than having to recomplete puzzles and take a second lap through large sections of the dungeon that I've already completed. Because of that, sometimes there is a little too much trial and error in that navigation on floor 1, especially when you factor in these teleport pad puzzles. But overall, it isn't anything that is a deal breaker, just a minor inconvenience here and there. Still, the dungeon is well balanced. Even though the challenges are genuinely a challenge, the dungeon offers you lots of resources and spots to breathe and refill hearts and magic. This includes multiple secret rooms with fairies to bottle, and even an opportunity to leave and restock on supplies before confronting Ganon. It does this by way of moving that Ganon fight to outside of the dungeon, so when that opportunity to stock up presents itself, it feels organic, as opposed to, say, I don't know, Fi outright telling me to go stock up on potions before the final boss fight. Thanks for that. So that's the end. You know, sometimes I think I mentally put this game up on a pedestal, but then I play it again, and it only reaffirms to me just how good of a game it is, how much of a marked improvement over the last 2 games this is. It's really a testament to its quality design here, how in only the 3rd installment in the series, so many ideas would get solidified, whether it be strong musical compositions or dungeon items or bosses who would reappear in some shape or form later on. This game oozes influence that is felt in pretty much every Zelda game to come after. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I hold a great deal of nostalgia for this game, but I genuinely adore it in a way that feels like the game earned it. So it is a little bittersweet to write the end of this script. That is the end of Dungeon Design in A Link to the Past. At least on the Super Nintendo. So during the course of working through A Link to the Past's dungeons, I have largely not acknowledged the Game Boy Advance re-release of the game, which released in 2002 bundled with 4 swords. The reason for this lack of acknowledgement was simply that I never played it. I never had a GBA back in the early 2000s, but a couple of my friends did. So my experience with this release was simply being able to occasionally weasel my way into their play sessions of 4 swords. And that was only a handful of times. And while I would later acquire a GBA and cartridge of this game for myself well into my adult years, it wasn't really feasible to record footage like this. That is, until it was added to the Game Boy Advance catalog of Nintendo Switch Online. So yes, I did play through the entire game again in a weekend, take notes, and gather some footage in order to add an extra little addendum to this video. Because here's the thing, the Game Boy Advance version of A Link to the Past has an extra dungeon, which means that despite all of the times I've played A Link to the Past over the years, there is technically a single dungeon I had never played before. The Palace of the Four Sword, which is unlocked after beating Ganon and rolling credits in A Link to the Past itself, as well as defeating Vati and finishing up Four Swords, all making for a very eventful weekend. Before jumping into the dungeon, a couple of things to address with the GBA version of the game overall. There may be a little nostalgia intertwined here with this opinion, but the original SNES release is still going to be my preferred version to play. The GBA screen crunch reduces the overall visibility of your surroundings, and the audio is noticeably more compressed here than on the SNES, making it feel like a claustrophobic and technically inferior version of the game, though it can't ever be overstated just how remarkable the Super Nintendo sound chip was for its time. For the most part though, this isn't too much of an issue. I was still able to thoroughly enjoy my playthrough of the game, but I can tell that this game was not designed with these limitations in mind, whereas original GBA titles would build their sound design around those technical parameters. Oh, and I hate that they added these voice clips for Link. They're right out of Ocarina of Time, but they sound so horrendously compressed on the GBA. Given the speed at which Link can slash his sword, unlike in the 3D titles, they just feel so out of place. The screen crunch also occasionally gets in the way of puzzles. In this cave in the original version, you can easily see that you need to hookshot across this gap, but on the GBA, you can't even see the other side of the gap. So you either have to go in with prior knowledge like me, or you'd have to essentially just guess. I don't love that, but there are some legit improvements here in this version of the game as well. I previously complained about this one puzzle in Mire, where you have to drop down to the floor below, and the fix that I had proposed when I wrote that is actually exactly what they did in this version. I also quite like that they show the dungeon names at the entrances now, so there's no argument about what Thieves Town is actually called here. And the boomerang cuts grass now, which is so weirdly satisfying. And you actually get to keep the shovel permanently. Oh hey, Maple is here now too. The infamous Ice Palace puzzle got a complete overhaul as well. I haven't yet decided if I like this change or not though. It feels a bit like a lateral move. It fixes it in some respects. There's no way to mess up the puzzle and have to do it again, but you are still forced to take a lap through this section of the dungeon, and the method of using the Cane of Samaria to skip the puzzle is entirely removed. Still, it's clear that the devs thought this puzzle stank and decided to try redesigning it, and I respect that. I just don't know if it's really an improvement. Otherwise, this is largely still the A Link to the Past that we all know and love, and I do feel that it's a perfectly valid way to play the game, but I think for my own enjoyment, that I'd rather just stick with the SNES version. So, now that I've gotten all of my general thoughts out there, I guess we should really look at the biggest difference in this version, the completely new dungeon. So, let's head inside. Welcome to the Palace of the Four Sword. So this dungeon is pretty good. After the chain chomp filled foyer, there is a large central room that essentially has 4 branching paths from it. At the end of each path is one of the 4 swords. Once each sword is collected, a path towards the boss fight is unlocked. You can do these 4 sections in any order, as they are all self-contained and not locked off. In this way, it resembles the dungeon structure of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom more than anything else in A Link to the Past itself. If you swapped out these swords for, say, a terminal, yeah, this would basically be a divine beast, but in 2D. In fact, it's especially like the Final Trial, the DLC dungeon for Breath of the Wild. Do I think this is a bad thing? No, not really. I don't dislike those dungeons for the most part, and this is the only dungeon like this in this game. So that's more of an observation than a complaint. Plus, it's really meant to be a bonus challenge, and so it structures itself as somewhere between a gauntlet and a boss rush, with repurposed elements from other dungeons being used to craft more devious puzzles and remixed boss battles at the end of each of the 4 paths. Visually speaking, the dungeon borrows most of its architecture and aesthetics from the Palace of Darkness, the first Dark World dungeon in the game, with some of its decor taken from other spots, like these skeletons on the wall, which are from Skull Woods, and these fountains from the Swamp Palace. This place also uses the same usual Dark World dungeon music, which is a bit of a disappointment. We've already gotten 8 dungeons in a row with this song, and this would have been a good opportunity to at least remix it, right? If not, give us an entirely new track. The level design here is pretty good though on a room-to-room basis, particularly with the puzzles. While I'm usually more of a fan of there being some sort of navigational challenge, I think the game has already given us our fair share of that in its other Dark World dungeons. Here, instead we've got individual room puzzles that put a twist on familiar elements, and even make use of mechanics that were either in the original game but had no real purpose or were underutilized. There are very few times where diving is actually necessary, but you've got to do it here to avoid this spike trap. And did you know you can break pots with arrows? I didn't, not until I was doing this dungeon and had to. And the Cane of Sumaria in particular gets some really good uses. You could always use it to create blocks and hold down floor switches, but now you've got to pick up and throw it, or actually use the beam function when you dispel it, which is quite literally never needed in the base game. Using the Pegasus boots to bounce off of walls was always there as a little exploit for getting into Misery Mire early, but it was never meant to be an intended puzzle solution in the original game, but here we need to do it in order to get over some gaps. There's also a puzzle here that is very similar to one from Skull Woods, but this time we've also got to use the hook shot. You may have surmised, but the puzzles here are quite a lot of fun. They almost have a sort of freshness to them, like they're new takes on mechanics that I'm already familiar with. And there's something really charming about that. I still hate ice physics though. The dungeon also has a pretty strong combat emphasis. The enemies here are some of the toughest around, like Hardhat Beetles, Stalfos Knights, Zazaks, and Terrorpins. Though maybe they got a little too trigger-happy placing Bari around here, there are tons of these guys. Oh, and there are like-likes here. I don't think there are any like-likes in the original game at all. Though, considering this is essentially a post-game challenge, it would have been pretty cool to see even tougher enemies in here, like Gibdos and Lynels. Of course, we can't talk about the combat challenge without addressing the 4 boss rematches. In no particular order, there is Argus, originally from the Swamp Palace, Blind from Thieves Town, Mothula from Skull Woods, and the Helmasaur King from the Palace of Darkness. While recycled bosses don't sound too exciting, I think a more accurate description would be remixed bosses, as they're all changed to be more difficult. Argus no longer has rocks protecting him. Now they're Bari, which kind of reminds me of Baronade from Ocarina of Time actually. And when he moves into his second phase, there are these water globules that will keep spawning to attack you, making it far more hectic. Oh, apparently these guys are named Cameron? I'm gonna call them Cameron. Blind is probably the boss with the least changes. He still does the same decapitating fireball and laser beam thing, but now you've got to knock his heads back into his body. So there's a neat strategic element there. Oh, and instead of being disguised as the maiden, he instead disguises himself as your uncle, which is neat. Uncle's dialogue from the start of the game was actually altered in the GBA version, but in this bit where Blind is impersonating him, they use the original SNES dialogue as a cheeky little reference. I like that. Mothula is totally different now. In Skull Woods, Mothula himself was not too hard, but that was made up for by a very hazardous arena. This time the arena has nothing going on, but Mothula will duplicate into 3, move much more erratically, and also there's bees. Finally, the Helmasaur King now attacks far more aggressively, summons little Helmasaurs to attack you, and has an additional phase where his mask regrows and has to be broken again. Also, Eyeball. The 4 bosses also get a new coat of paint, being unified in a green and orange color palette, which makes them a bit distinct from their original dungeon boss counterparts, so that's neat. Overall, these guys are fun to refight, but the real challenge is still ahead. So, with all 4 of these guys re-defeated, and by extension all 4 swords collected, we can break this barrier, cross this invisible bridge, and confront the dungeon boss. This is it. Our final challenge will be facing off against Dark Link. Well, 4 Dark Links, actually, corresponding to each of the 4 swords, and each getting more difficult than the last. Being Dark Link, they are basically recolored sprites, but each retaining the color corresponding to the 4 links of 4 swords, though in A Link to the Past's art style. I like this fight. It's a legit challenge, and they put a bunch of Link's own tools to use here. They can attack with their swords, as you'd expect, but also use the Pegasus boots, and this bigger version of the spin attack. They use a down thrust, sort of like Zelda 2, too, but with the animation of when you're using the Quake Medallion. Oh, and they even whip out the magic cape, and sometimes jump backwards to avoid attacks. This is fantastic. Of course, they do cycle out one at a time. I think if you fought all 4 at once, that it would simply be too overwhelming. But they use that pacing to keep scaling up the movesets and difficulty. So, well done. This is truly a great fight. One that will put even the most skilled A Link to the Past players to the test. In fact, during this playthrough, I went and bought these 4 potions before heading into Turtle Rock, and I didn't end up dipping into any of them until this dungeon, and by the end of it, I had used all 4 of them up. It's actually pretty refreshing to play A Link to the Past and be challenged in that way again. Other than that, I don't have too much more to say about this battle. It is really fun, and genuinely challenging in the best way possible, which fits for what is essentially a post-game bonus challenge. So that's it. Once all 4 Dark Links are defeated, an alternate version of the credits will roll, bringing our time with A Link to the Past to a close. So overall, the Palace of the Four Sword is a pretty short dungeon, but what it lacks in length, it makes up for with some very well-tuned challenges. From items that get put to use in new and creative ways, to remixed bosses that pack an extra punch, to a final sword duel, this dungeon remains a consistent challenge start to finish in a great way. I really enjoyed my brief time in this dungeon. If not for the challenge, then for the strange joy of being able to experience something new that I never had before, within the context of A Link to the Past, a game that I'm otherwise intimately familiar with. I've been sleeping on this one for too long. So this brings dungeon design in A Link to the Past to a close for real this time. It's a little bittersweet. I'd like to thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this, especially if you got this far. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. Thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.